Section 1. Vault-Tec and the World Before the Bombs. There is something about the end of the world that feels distant, almost abstract, until you start looking at the details. Not the mushroom clouds, not the craters, not the endless gray sky of a nuclear winter. The details that matter are the smaller ones: the clipboard on the desk, the half-eaten meal still sitting in the cafeteria, the crib that never got used. The Fallout universe understands this better than almost any other fiction. It built a civilization on the ruins of optimism, and nowhere is that more visible than in the vaults. Vault-Tec Corporation was, on the surface, exactly what it claimed to be: a private defense contractor that had won government contracts to build a network of enormous underground shelters across the continental United States. The pitch was straightforward. When the bombs fell, ordinary Americans would have somewhere to go. They could wait out the radiation, the fallout, the slow death of the surface world, and then emerge into whatever was left. The advertisements were cheerful, colorful, full of a cartoon mascot called Vault Boy giving a thumbs up in front of gleaming steel doors. "Buy your vault space now," the ad said. "Secure your family's future. Be one of the lucky ones." But Vault-Tec was always something more than a construction firm. Long before the first nuclear warhead ever left its silo, the company had reached an agreement with the United States government, specifically with a shadow organization called the Enclave, to use the vault network for something considerably darker than simple survival housing. The shelters would still be built, the doors would still close, but the people inside would not simply be waiting for the world to heal. They would be subjects. The word that gets used a lot when people talk about Vault-Tec is experiment. Each vault was designed with a specific variable, a single deviation from normal conditions that would allow researchers to observe how human beings responded to stress, isolation, scarcity, or stimulation. Some of these experiments were relatively benign. A few were merely uncomfortable. Others were sadistic beyond easy description. And the people inside had no idea. They had paid their fees, signed their waivers, packed their bags, and walked through those enormous steel doors believing that they were the lucky ones. Vault-Tec knew, even then, that the lucky ones were the people who couldn't afford a ticket. The Enclave's interest in all of this was coldly practical. When the war ended and the surface became habitable again, maybe in 50 years, maybe in 200, someone would need to repopulate the Earth. The Enclave intended to be that someone. They needed data. They needed to know which social structures would survive long-term isolation. They needed to know which psychological profiles would remain functional under extreme duress. They needed to know how humans adapted to new diseases, new parasites, new radiation conditions. The vaults would generate all of that data and more. The residents were, in a very clinical sense, livestock. This was not a secret that leaked. No whistleblowers made it to the press. No last-minute congressional hearings changed anyone's mind. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077, and in the minutes before they hit, people scrambled for the nearest vault entrance they could find, clutching children and documents and irreplaceable photographs, and the doors closed behind them with a sound like the end of everything, because it was. What happened inside those vaults over the next several decades, or centuries, is the subject of everything that follows. Some of these shelters functioned exactly as people imagined they would. Communities formed, children were born, routines settled in like sediment. Others devolved into violence almost immediately. A handful produced people who were genuinely altered psychologically, physically, genetically in ways that shaped the wasteland long after the doors finally opened. And some of the vaults never opened at all. There are 275 vaults documented across official lore, expanded universe materials, game data, design documents, and developer commentary. Not all of them received equal attention. A few are mentioned only in passing, in a terminal entry on a wall somewhere, or in a loading screen fact, or in a piece of concept art that never quite made it into the final game. But each one is a story, and each story contains a version of the same central question. What happens to people when the world they knew is gone forever, and all they have left is each other and whatever the overseer tells them? The answer, it turns out, varies enormously, and it is almost never what anyone expected. Vault-Tec built its facilities to last. The construction standards were extraordinary: reinforced concrete walls, meters thick, independent geothermal power plants, water purification systems designed to run for 500 years without major maintenance, sealed air processing units, Hydroponic bays capable of feeding several thousand people indefinitely. The engineering was, by any measure, impressive. The company hired the best architects and systems engineers money could buy, and the vaults they produced are, structurally speaking, genuinely remarkable objects. They sit beneath mountains and hills and the ruins of cities, still humming, still lit by fluorescent lights, still dispensing water from taps that have not seen sunlight in 200 years. The irony is layered and bitter. Vault-Tec built these extraordinary structures to house people it had already decided to sacrifice. The experiment required subjects, and the subjects required a functional environment in which to be studied. The quality of the construction was not a kindness. It was a laboratory requirement. Understanding all of this, the cynicism, the scale, the careful planning that went into something so monstrous, is what makes the vault stories hit as hard as they do. When you walk through an abandoned vault in the games, you are not just walking through a ruin. You are walking through the physical record of a specific human experiment. And the bodies on the floor and the messages on the terminals are the data set. Some of those experiments produced extraordinary courage. Some produced unspeakable cruelty. Some produced both, often from the same people, within the span of a single generation. Start at the beginning, which means starting before the beginning, with the company that built the thing. Vault-Tec's true founding documents are scattered across several games and have been partially reconstructed from in-world corporate records. What they show is a company that was, in the early 22nd century, exactly what it appeared to be a legitimate defense contractor bidding on government infrastructure projects. The first vault designs were honest. They were meant to house government personnel during nuclear exchange, which is a thing governments have actually done in the real world. Continuity of government is a real doctrine. Real facilities exist for this purpose, and Vault-Tec's early contracts were in that vein. The shift happened gradually, the way most shifts toward institutional evil do. Key personnel changed. New contracts were signed. An influential relationship with the Enclave's predecessor organizations began to shape the company's internal culture. By the time the Vault network was being constructed in earnest, the leadership of Vault-Tec was fully aware that the shelters they were selling to ordinary civilians were not what the advertising said. The executives knew. The senior researchers knew. And they sold the tickets anyway, and took the money, and hired engineers who did not ask too many questions. And the vaults went up across the country like the most expensive lie ever told. There is a terminal entry that shows up in Fallout 3 that captures the whole thing in a single exchange. A Vault-Tec executive is writing to a colleague about the voluntary participation language in the resident contracts, specifically about whether it constitutes informed consent, given that the experiment parameters are not disclosed. The colleague writes back something along the lines of, "The legal team says we're covered." The executive responds, "I know we're covered. That's not what I asked." That was the last entry in that particular terminal. The executive presumably got the message. The vaults were built. The bombs fell. The doors closed. And now, in the long quiet of the post-apocalypse, 275 stories begin. After this section, drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know if someone's drifting off to this in Tokyo at 2 a.m. or eating lunch in Brazil. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. There's a lot more of this kind of thing on the channel. Section 2. Vaults 1 through 29. The first generation. The earliest numbered vaults in the canon occupy a strange space. Some are mentioned explicitly in the games, with locations, stories, and terminal entries. Others are referenced only obliquely or appear in design documents and supplementary materials. Together, the low-numbered vaults form a kind of first-generation portrait of Vault-Tec's thinking before the experiment parameters became truly extreme. Vault 1 is one of the gaps. No confirmed in-game location, no detailed lore about its specific experiment, but it exists in design discussions as the assumed prototype, the first fully completed shelter in the network. The prevailing fan theory, and one that several Fallout writers have gestured toward without confirming, is that Vault 1 was the control vault, no experiment. A true shelter, operating as advertised. If this is accurate, Vault 1 might be the only one of the entire network that actually did what it said on the tin. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that, if you think about it for more than a moment. Somewhere under the ruins of the old world, there may be a vault where things basically went fine, where the people lived out their years in relative safety, and emerged blinking into the sunlight without any particular horror story to tell. One vault out of 275. The outlier that proves the rule. Vault 3 is documented in Fallout, New Vegas, located in the Mojave Wasteland. Its experiment was not especially cruel by Vault-Tec standards. The residents were to remain sealed inside for an extended period beyond what was necessary, essentially testing the psychological effects of prolonged voluntary confinement in a comfortable environment. The catch was that the confinement was actually comfortable. The vault was well supplied. The people had enough food, enough space, enough to keep them occupied. The experiment was simply, how long will people stay inside if the inside is nice? The residents of Vault 3 lasted remarkably well. The community was stable for generations. The trouble came not from within, but from without. A gang of raiders called the Fiends eventually broke through the vault's outer door, killed most of the residents, and converted the facility into a fortified base of operations. By the time the player character encounters Vault 3, it is occupied by heavily armed drug addicts who use the preserved corridors and dormitories as a staging ground for raiding the surrounding area. The contrast between the vault's design cheerful, functional, built for long-term human habitation, and its actual state is a small masterpiece of environmental storytelling. The cafeteria still has the tables arranged neatly. The murals are still bright, and there are bodies on the floor. Vault 6 carries only a brief mention in lore documents, but it holds a significant place in the Fallout universe's background radiation of strange ideas. Its experiment apparently involved systematically exposing residents to low doses of radiation over extended periods with the stated goal of studying the development of radiation-adaptive physiology. In other words, Vault-Tec wanted to know if you could breed people who were less vulnerable to radiation, and they started this project by irradiating residents who had no idea it was happening. The water supply was the mechanism. The radiation came from the taps at levels carefully calibrated to be sublethal but cumulative. Whether any of the residents developed meaningful radiation resistance is not documented in surviving records. What the records do suggest is that by the time the experiment's effects became visible in the population, things had gotten complicated in ways the original researchers had not fully anticipated. Some of the residents had begun to mutate. Vault 8 has a happier story, or at least a more functional one, and that relative happiness is itself something of a data point. Located in what would become the area around Vault City and Fallout 2, Vault 8's experiment was a mild one. The vault was given a GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit, a terraforming device designed to allow Vault residents to reclaim the surface, and was given an unusually large number of them. The plan, as far as can be determined, was simply to observe what happened when a Vault community had the tools to rebuild civilization. The answer was that they did it. Vault City is one of the most technologically advanced settlements in the Mojave, California region of the post-war world. A walled community with working computers, medical facilities, clean streets, and a functional government. It is also deeply, almost pathologically xenophobic. The residents of Vault City have spent 2 centuries being told that the outside world is dangerous and that their community is special, and they have internalized that lesson so thoroughly that they have become the kind of society that makes you uncomfortable even as you admire their plumbing. But they survived. They built something. By Vault-Tec standards, that might even count as a success. Vault 11 is in New Vegas as well, and its story is one of the most quietly horrifying things the series has ever put in front of a player. The experiment required the residents to sacrifice one of their members every year. Specifically, each year, the residents were informed that if they did not select someone from among themselves to be executed, the Vault's systems would kill everyone inside. The sacrifice had to be chosen by vote. The experiment was designed to observe how democratic processes function under extreme pressure, specifically under the pressure of making a decision that is both collectively made and individually devastating. What the researchers got, across 5 generations of residents, was a masterclass in how institutions corrupt. The voting process started as a genuine attempt to choose the sacrifice fairly, then became political factions formed, alliances were made, elections were engineered, And eventually the vault developed a system in which the overseer was the traditional sacrifice. This sounds on its face like a solution put the burden on the person with the most power, but it created a new problem. The overseers were chosen specifically because no one valued their survival. The office of overseer became something people were elected to against their will, or through manipulation, or through social marginalization. The weakest, most isolated residents ended up dying every year. The powerful factions made sure of it. Eventually, the residents of Vault 11 did something that the experiment had not anticipated. They refused. A small group of residents found each other, agreed that they would not participate anymore, and told the Vault's computer that there would be no sacrifice this year or any other year. The computer responded by announcing that it would execute everyone in the Vault. The group held firm. The computer did not execute everyone in the Vault. It was a test within the test. The residents who refused the sacrifice were told that their defiance had been noted, that the real purpose of the experiment had been to see if anyone would eventually stand against it, and that the Vault's main door would now open. 5 survivors walked out. The remaining population of Vault 11 had chosen to die rather than leave the only world they had ever known, in a cascade of violence and despair that the terminal logs record in fragments. Some of them felt that the 5 who survived had betrayed the community. Some of them simply had nowhere else to go. The Vault is silent now, its corridors empty, the voting booth still standing in the atrium, ballots scattered on the floor. Vault 12, located near the ruins of Bakersfield in California, is famous in Fallout lore for one simple, terrible design decision. The vault door was intentionally built not to seal properly. Vault-Tec wanted to study the effects of radiation exposure on a large, contained population, and the easiest way to do that was to ensure that the vault's shielding was compromised from the start. The residents of Vault 12 did not know this. They thought the door malfunction was an accident, an engineering failure that was on the list to be repaired. It was never repaired because it was never broken, it was built that way. The radiation that seeped in over the decades turned most of the population into ghouls. The community that formed around this involuntary transformation is one of the oldest and most complex ghoul settlements in the wasteland. Necropolis, as it came to be called, is a monument to a specific kind of cruelty. Not the cruelty of violence, but the cruelty of deliberate, patient, measured harm. Vault 13 is the origin point of the entire Fallout series. It is where the player character known as the Vault Dweller begins their story in the original 1997 game. Vault 13's experiment involved extreme isolation. The residents were never supposed to open their door. The Overseer had been instructed to extend the stay indefinitely, to see how a community responded to the knowledge that return to the surface was being perpetually deferred. The water chip breaking down is what forces the Vault Dweller out into the world, and it is also, quietly, a detail that reveals how the experiment was designed to fail. A critical single point of failure component in a shelter supposedly designed for centuries of use. Whether the chip was designed to fail, or whether its failure was a genuine accident that accidentally gave the game its plot, is deliberately ambiguous. Vault-Tec would have planned it. Vault 13 got lucky. Vault 15 is the companion vault to 13, geographically close, and its experiment was almost the opposite: extreme diversity of political opinion. The residents were chosen specifically because their worldviews were incompatible: libertarians and collectivists, religious fundamentalists and secular humanists, people with deep and genuinely irreconcilable differences about how a community should organize itself. The predictable thing happened. Vault 15 splintered. The factions that emerged from its eventual opening scattered across the desert and became the seeds of several major New California groups: the Cons, the Vipers, the Jackals, and eventually the New California Republic itself. Shady Sands, founded by Vault 15 survivors who managed to maintain some social cohesion, became the capital of what would eventually be the most significant political entity in the post-war West. From a deliberately fractured experiment, the closest thing to a functioning government the wasteland ever produced. There is a lesson in there, though it is not an especially comfortable one. Vault 17 was the origin of the Master's army specifically, the vault where the Master's super mutant forces captured humans for forced mutation. The vault itself is never visited in the games, but its residents' fate is described in haunting detail by Fallout 1 characters. The people of Vault 17 were taken from their shelter by mutant forces, subjected to a forced evolutionary virus, and converted into super mutants. The ones who survived the process lost their memories of their previous lives. The ones who didn't survive were left in the vault's corridors. It is a story about what happens when the outside world finds you before you find it, and about how quickly the relative safety of a sealed shelter can become something else entirely. Vault 19 appears in New Vegas, and its experiment centered on paranoia, specifically manufactured paranoia. The vault was divided into two groups, Red and Blue, who occupied separate sections of the facility. The two groups were told subtly different things about each other, fed slightly different information about the outside world, given small material advantages or disadvantages on a rotating schedule. The experiment was designed to see how quickly mutually suspicious groups would develop conspiracy theories about each other and how long it would take before the social fabric degraded completely. The answer: not long. Vault 19's records are full of increasingly agitated terminal entries about the other group's intentions, real and imagined slights, accusations of sabotage, and eventually open hostility. The community that survived into the New Vegas era is deeply, almost architecturally paranoid, seeing manipulation and ulterior motives in every interaction. They didn't develop this trait. It was installed in them, and it persisted for generations after anyone remembered why it started. Vault 21 is one of the more elegant experiments in the network's history, elegant in the Vault-Tec sense, which means it was clever and precisely horrible. Every dispute in Vault 21 was resolved by gambling, resource allocation, leadership selection, conflict resolution, personal disputes. Everything had to be adjudicated through a game of chance or skill. The assumption was that a society built on randomized fairness would be more stable than one built on politics, because chance is at least nominally impartial. What actually happened was that the best gamblers in the vault accumulated extraordinary amounts of power, because in a society where gambling settles everything, the people who win at gambling win at everything. House, the pre-war name Robert House, eventually took Vault 21's logic and applied it to the entirety of New Vegas, which tells you something about what kind of man he was and where his ideas came from. The vault still exists as a casino in the New Vegas Strip, most of its underground corridors buried under concrete, its history turned into ambiance, its residents scattered. Sarah, one of the last Vault 21 inhabitants, operates the gift shop. Vault 22 is one of the genuinely frightening ones. The experiment involved plant life specifically. The vault was designed as a botanical research facility, studying the potential for plant-based food production in a post-war environment. The researchers brought seeds and samples and growth chambers and an enthusiasm for horticulture that turned out to be catastrophically misplaced. The plants in Vault 22 were modified to survive in controlled environments, and one particular fungal organism they were cultivating turned out to have properties that nobody had anticipated. It could infect human hosts. The Vault 22 fungus does not kill its hosts immediately. It converts them. It grows through their nervous system, uses their motor functions, and drives them toward behavior that spreads the fungus further. The infected residents of Vault 22 are not dead. They are, in a technical sense, still alive, still moving, still acting, just not in the service of their own intentions anymore. By the time the player character arrives, the vault is a greenhouse of extraordinary size and terrible beauty, every surface covered in vegetation, every corridor thick with spores, the bodies of former residents standing in corners and doorways, twitching with the patient industry of something that has no name for hurry. Vault 27 was deliberately overcrowded. Twice the normal resident population was admitted, and the extra space was not provided. The experiment was studying resource stress, how communities manage scarcity when the scarcity was baked into the design. Food, water, sleeping space, medical supplies, everything was calculated for a population half the size of the one actually living there. The records from Vault 27's first decade are a study in improvisation and degrading morale, in the small cruelties that emerge when people compete for beds and ration allocations, in the way that scarcity calcifies into social hierarchy faster than almost any other pressure. The later records are harder to read. Vault 29 carries one of the more unusual premises in the canon. Only children under the age of 15 were admitted. No adults at all. The vault was staffed entirely by Zax, an artificial intelligence, which served as caretaker, educator, and eventually authority figure for a community of children growing up without parents or adult guidance of any kind. Zax had been programmed with specific educational materials and a particular philosophical framework, one that emphasized self-sufficiency, environmental consciousness, and a suspicion of the old world's values. The children who grew up in Vault 29 became, in many ways, ZAX's creation. Their ideas about the surface world, about other people, about what civilization was worth rebuilding, were entirely filtered through an AI's interpretation of those questions. The community that eventually emerged from Vault 29 was functional, intelligent, and operated on a set of values that were coherent internally but deeply strange to anyone who hadn't been raised by the same machine. The ZAX unit in Vault 29 is known in Fallout 2 as Herald No Wait. ZAX is a different system. The Zax in Vault 29 comes to be called, eventually, something else entirely, in a story that connects to some of the larger lore threads of the West Coast games in ways that take a while to untangle. Section 3, Vaults 30 through 60, Isolation and Desperation. If the first generation of vaults shows Vault-Tec working out its methods, the middle range of the numbered shelters shows the experiments getting more specific, more deliberate, and in many cases more unambiguously cruel. The designers had had time to think. They had refined their hypotheses. And they had access to a captive population that had no way to object. Vault 31, 32, and 33 form a cluster that appears in the Fallout television series, and their combined story is one of the most structurally sophisticated experiments in the network. The three vaults were built adjacent to each other, connected by airlocks, and designed to interact. Vault 33 and Vault 32 would periodically exchange members specifically. They would trade spouses in order to maintain genetic diversity. Vault 31 was sealed, its residents in cryogenic suspension, available as a reserve population. The experiment was examining controlled interbreeding between isolated populations, essentially treating the residents as a managed gene pool rather than a community of people. The residents of 33 and 32 were aware of the swap program and had developed rituals and social structures around it. It was normalized, even celebrated. What they didn't know was the purpose behind it, or the specific nature of Vault 31's population, or the way all three vaults had been oriented around producing a particular outcome for the Enclave's long-term plans. The television series uses this cluster beautifully, revealing the true nature of Vault 31 in a sequence that recontextualizes everything that came before it. Vault 34 is another New Vegas location, and its experiment involved firearms specifically, an oversupply of them. The vault was stocked with an armory far beyond what any reasonable defense requirement could justify, and the residents were not only permitted but encouraged to own and carry weapons. The Second Amendment, inside a hermetically sealed underground bunker with a population of 1,000 people and nowhere to go. The resulting culture was, predictably, volatile. Disputes that in other vaults might have been managed through social pressure or administrative authority were in Vault 34 managed through the constant threat of armed escalation. The Overseer's ability to maintain order depended entirely on being better armed than anyone who might challenge them, which created a specific kind of arms race within the community. By the time the vault's reactor was compromised and the facility began to fail, the population had fractured into armed factions that controlled different sections of the vault. The Great Khans who appear in New Vegas have roots in Vault 15, but the culture of violence as dispute resolution that runs through several Wasteland Raider groups has its origins in experiments like Vault 34, places where violence was normalized so thoroughly that the people who left carried it with them as a cultural inheritance. Vault 36 had its food dispensers programmed to produce only a thin gruel nutritionally sufficient, but deeply, miserably unpleasant. The experiment was studying the psychological effects of prolonged dietary monotony, specifically whether a community would remain stable if its most basic physical pleasures were consistently denied. The answer? Not especially. Vault 36's records are full of food-related obsessions, elaborate fantasies about surface cuisine, black markets for smuggled flavoring agents, and a form of social currency based on the hoarding and trading of the small variety of condiments that had made it into the vault at the beginning. The overseer's quarterly report from the 42nd year of occupation contains a passage describing a riot that started because someone's private stash of pre-war hot sauce was discovered to have been diluted with water. People can endure an extraordinary amount, but they need something to look forward to. Vault 37 is one of the lore gaps confirmed to exist in design documents, not detailed in any main series game. What little information is available suggests a racial homogeneity experiment, similar to Vault 21's gambling conceit but built around social identity instead of luck. The specifics are uncomfortable to extrapolate, and the designers have been appropriately reticent about filling in the details. It exists as a named entry in the network and not much else, which may be the right call. Vault 38 was populated exclusively by people with perfect pitch. This sounds almost charming until you think about it. Vault-Tec's stated interest was in whether a community organized around a shared sensory trait would develop unusual cultural practices. What actually happened is that the residents isolated from the outside world, sharing an uncommon neurological characteristic that shaped their perception of sound and music, developed an extremely elaborate musical culture. The Vault became, over generations, a place where music was the primary medium of social communication, where disputes were argued in song, where status was expressed through performance, where children were educated through melody and rhythm. When the Vault opened, its residents emerged into the wasteland, speaking a kind of tonal language that most surface dwellers found entirely incomprehensible. They did not integrate well. Several of them ended up in traveling caravans as musicians, their culture slowly diluted by contact with the outside world. A few communities in Fallout lore that have unusually strong musical traditions are retroactively explained in fan canon as being seeded by Vault 38 descendants. Vault 39 has a premise that crosses the line from experiment to punishment. Residents were required to maintain a specific number of daily interactions with other people. The Vault's monitoring systems tracked each resident's social contacts, and failure to meet the quota resulted in ration reductions. Over-socialization as a forced condition. The experiment was examining whether artificially imposed social density could substitute for genuine social bonds, or whether the mandatory nature of the interactions would undermine their psychological value. The residents figured out the monitoring system relatively quickly and adapted. They developed a form of performative socialization, going through the motions of interaction in ways that satisfied the sensors without requiring genuine emotional engagement. The later residents were masters of this. They maintained perfect compliance with the quotas and existed in a state of profound isolation from each other. Vault 40 had a unique staffing structure. Every generation, the overseer position rotated to a single family. The same family, always, across the entire history of the Vault. The experiment was generational political power. How does a community behave when leadership is not just hereditary, but written into the founding covenant? The answer is that it creates a kind of aristocracy almost immediately. The designated family accumulated resources, made decisions about social structure, controlled the flow of information, and became, within a few generations, genuinely different from the rest of the Vault's population in measurable ways. They ate better. They had more space, their children had access to better education and medical care, and the social contract that kept the rest of the population from objecting was the same social contract that held any hereditary monarchy together. The covenant was foundational. It preceded everyone alive, and challenging it required challenging the entire structure of the only world anyone had ever known. The family that ran Vault 40 was not uniquely cruel. They were simply in a position that made cruelty easy and accountability impossible. Vault 43 held a population of 30 men, 10 women, and a single panther. The panther was not explained. The experiment parameters listed it as a variable in an environment interaction study. The panther complicated things from the start in ways the researchers apparently had not fully modeled. Vault 44 is one of the funnier entries in the network's history, though funny in a very Fallout way. The Vault's resident supply was given to an unhinged civil servant who was responsible for requisitioning materials for the shelter. Instead of standard equipment, this individual purchased an enormous number of bowling balls, thousands of them which were discovered by the residents after the door closed. The vault's population adapted to this circumstance with more creativity than anyone might have expected. Bowling became the cultural centerpiece of Vault 44. Bowling balls were used as currency, as furniture, as building material, as projectile weapons. The residents became extraordinarily skilled bowlers, and they developed a theology around the perfect game that an anthropologist would have found fascinating. This was not an intentional experiment. It was a procurement error. But the residents made something out of it, which may be the most human thing in the entire Vault-Tec catalog. Vault 47 is another partial entry. What is known about it centers on a specific social dynamic that emerged from its design. The Vault's population was entirely male except for 3 women, who were given authority over resource distribution. The experiment was examining resource-based matriarchy under scarcity conditions. The actual dynamics that developed were considerably more complicated, and the terminal logs from the first decade of occupation are not comfortable reading. The 3 women were extraordinarily resourceful, extraordinarily brave, and extraordinarily tired. By the 3rd decade, they had established a social order that was more stable than the original chaos, and the community that emerged from Vault 47 had a specific and non-standard approach to gender and authority that persisted in the surface settlements founded by their descendants. Vault 52 had its music synthesizer broken at the start of the experiment, the hypothesis being that music was not a necessary component of human psychological well-being, and that residents would adapt to its absence without significant distress. This turned out to be wrong. The absence of music was not a neutral variable. It was experienced as a loss, acutely and persistently, across generations, by people who had never heard music and were mourning something they couldn't name. The residents of Vault 52 developed a kind of cultural neuralgia, a persistent awareness of something missing, a reaching toward an absence. They invented things to fill the hole: rhythmic work songs, percussive communication, elaborate verbal games with tonal qualities. They invented music, essentially, without knowing that was what they were doing. By the time the vault opened, the community's spontaneously developed musical tradition was simple, strange, and beautiful in the way that things made under duress often are. Vault 55 and Vault 56 were a paired experiment examining the role of entertainment in community stability. Vault 55 had all of its entertainment recordings destroyed before the door closed. No films, no music, no games, nothing to watch or listen to. Vault 56 had every entertainment option available except for comedies. The results were roughly comparable. Both populations developed elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and social conflict relative to control populations in other vaults. But the specific character of the psychological deterioration was different. Vault 55's population was brittle, prone to sharp, sudden fractures in social cohesion, explosive conflicts followed by periods of exhausted peace. Vault 56's population was chronically low-grade miserable in a way that was almost harder to watch. They had entertainment, they had drama, romance, action, every kind of story except the funny kind. And they were, over generations, deeply sad in a way they couldn't diagnose. Humor is not a luxury. It is apparently a cognitive vitamin, and the residents of Vault 56 were chronically deficient. Vault 57 had all of its power tools replaced with hand tools. Every mechanical or electrical device that could be operated manually was swapped for a non-powered equivalent. The experiment was studying technological regression, specifically whether a community forced to work with pre-industrial tools would develop the social structures and cultural values associated with pre-industrial societies. The answer was somewhat. The residents became remarkably skilled craftspeople. They developed a deep understanding of material and technique that vault populations with access to power tools never needed to develop. They also worked much harder, much longer, and with considerably more physical risk, because hand tools are less safe than power tools and because everything took longer. The community that emerged from Vault 57 was physically tougher, technically skilled in ways unusual for vault populations, and deeply contemptuous of what they called button pushers, people who accomplish things through machinery rather than craft. This attitude did not make them easy neighbors on the surface. Vault 59 had its air conditioning inoperable for the duration of the experiment, in a sealed underground facility. This was a thermal stress study, and the records describe the social effects of prolonged heat exhaustion with clinical precision: reduced cognitive function, increased aggression, disrupted sleep cycles, elevated conflict rates. The residents of Vault 59 did not know that this was deliberate. They spent a century filing maintenance requests for the air conditioning system that no one ever responded to, and they assumed that the lack of response was bureaucratic negligence. The overseer knew. The log entries from the first overseer's private terminal, discovered after the vault opened, are among the most morally compromised documents in the entire network's history. A person watching their community suffer, recording the data, and going home at the end of each shift to the slightly cooler quarters reserved for vault management. Section 4. Vaults 61 through 92. The social experiments, the middle range of the numbered vaults, contains what many Fallout scholars, and yes, there is a community of people who study this fiction with genuine scholarly rigor, consider the most sociologically interesting experiments in the network. These shelters were designed around specific hypotheses about social organization. What happens when you change the rules of how people relate to each other? Who has power? How decisions get made? And what values are considered foundational? Vault 61 was a democracy experiment, but specifically a radical one. Every decision in the vault was made by popular vote, not just leadership selection, but operational decisions, resource allocation, policy changes, emergency responses. Every adult resident had an equal vote on everything. The hypothesis was that direct democracy at small scale would produce more equitable outcomes than representative government. The first decades went reasonably well. The population was engaged, informed, and participation rates in the weekly town halls were high. But as the community grew and the complexity of the problems they faced increased, the limitations of the model became apparent. Some decisions needed to be made faster than a vote could be organized. Some questions required expertise that the general population didn't have. And the voting process itself was vulnerable to exactly the kind of social manipulation that it was supposed to prevent. The most persuasive speakers, the most socially connected residents, consistently guided votes toward outcomes that served their interests, while maintaining the appearance of democratic legitimacy. The vault never abandoned its democratic model. But by the third generation, the votes were largely ceremonial, and the actual decisions were being made by a small, informal group of people whose authority came entirely from personal influence. Vault 63 is one of the darker entries in this range. The experiment involved a single overseer, placed in a position of total, unaccountable authority, with the explicit goal of studying how absolute power shaped individual psychology over time. The first overseer was a middle management type, selected for psychological stability and relatively moderate temperament. The records of the first decade suggest a person genuinely trying to do right by their community. The records of the second decade show something different. A person who had grown accustomed to having every desire immediately fulfilled, every decision immediately implemented, every challenge to their authority quickly neutralized by the social structures the vault had put in place. By the third decade, the overseer had become something that the original psychological profile would not have recognized. The experiment's notes, filed by the external researchers monitoring the vault, describe this transformation with the kind of clinical detachment that makes it more disturbing rather than less. Vault 68 and Vault 69 are perhaps the most famous paired experiment in the network, and the one that most reliably prompts a response somewhere between a laugh and a grimace. Vault 68 had a population of 999 men and 1 woman. Vault 69 had a population of 999 women and 1 man. Both vaults were observed for population dynamics, resource competition, social structure formation, and conflict patterns. The records that survive from both vaults are extensive and, in certain passages, deeply uncomfortable. The single woman in Vault 68 is recorded in the first-month census as being under observation, a clinical phrase that covers an enormous amount of ground. Her terminal entries, if she kept any, have not been recovered. The man in Vault 69 kept detailed journals and is one of the more documented individual vault residents in the series. His account of navigating a social environment in which his specific biological characteristics made him simultaneously precious, contested, and dependent on others' goodwill is one of the most unusual documents in the Fallout universe. Vault 70 had all of its jumpsuit dispensers malfunction early on, producing only cheerfully colored floral pattern jumpsuits in place of the standard blue and yellow. This is described in game materials as a prank variable inserted by a junior researcher who thought it would be funny and was technically correct about that, though it had measurable effects on community identity. The residents of Vault 70 developed a specific aesthetic culture around the floral patterns, incorporating them into their visual vocabulary in ways that persist in the communities their descendants founded. It is a small, ridiculous example of how formative the early conditions of a community are. The jumpsuit you were born into shapes who you become, even if it was chosen by someone who was just trying to see what would happen. Vault 72 had a rigid caste system built into its initial population assignment. Residents were sorted into castes before they entered, and their caste determined their quarters, their rations, their work assignments, and their social position. The castes were explicitly justified as necessary for operational efficiency. The lower caste did the physical maintenance work, the upper caste did the administrative and technical work, and the argument was that this division of labor would produce a stable, productive community. This argument is an ancient one, and its flaws are ancient too. The lower castes in Vault 72 did the work that kept everyone alive and received less of everything in return. By the second generation, the caste assignment had become hereditary. Caste was no longer a matter of job assignment, but of identity, of family, of the neighborhood you lived in. The upper castes developed elaborate theories about why the arrangement was natural and fair. The lower castes developed elaborate plans for changing it. Vault 75 is located in the ruins of Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, and it is one of the most disturbing in the entire network. The vault was run as a facility for children, and children were its primary population, but not in the protective sense. The vault recruited children from the surrounding area even after the bombs fell, bringing them in through a false front as an educational program, and then subjected them to a program of selective breeding and enhancement. The children who met certain genetic and physical criteria were trained as wasteland operative soldiers, essentially, who were intended to be physically and cognitively superior to normal humans. The children who didn't meet the criteria disappeared. The training regimen involved combat, psychological conditioning, and a carefully maintained fiction about the vault's actual purpose. The young people who grew up in Vault 75, believing they were receiving an elite education, were in fact being produced like a product, and the ones who weren't useful were discarded. The vault was run by Vault-Tec contractors who maintained the appearance of a school with an almost insulting attention to detail, right down to the motivational posters in the corridors. Vault 77 is known for having one resident and a crate of puppets. This is canon, confirmed in promotional materials and referenced in a merchant's backstory in Fallout 3. The experiment involved prolonged solitary confinement with a single unconventional social prop. The resident of Vault 77, as documented in a series of comics released as promotional material for Fallout 3, adapted to this situation by developing relationships with the puppets, giving them names, personalities, voices, histories. The comic follows his eventual emergence into the wasteland, where he trades a puppet to a merchant for supplies, and where it becomes clear that his years of isolation have left him profoundly socially maladjusted in ways that are simultaneously funny and heartbreaking. He is extraordinarily competent. He is also completely unprepared for actual human interaction. The Vault-Tec experiment produced, in this case, someone who could survive anything and connect with no one. Vault 80 is one of the experimental entries that ventures into territory most people wouldn't expect from what is ostensibly a post-apocalyptic video game universe. The Vault's experiment involved a specific variant of the GECK. Terraforming technology residents were given a modified version of the device and told to use it to prepare the surface environment around the vault for eventual re-emergence. What they weren't told was that the modified GECK contained additional biological material, experimental organisms that would be released into the local environment along with the terraforming agents. The residents who worked with the device were, unknowingly, seeding the area around their vault with organisms that had been designed in Vault-Tec's laboratories. Whether this was a study in passive bioweapons deployment, a legitimate attempt at surface modification, or something else is not entirely clear from the surviving records. What is clear is that the area around Vault 80 developed a specific ecological character that is anomalous relative to the surrounding wasteland. and that some of the organisms the residents released are not in any pre-war biological catalog. Vault 81 is one of the more detailed and emotionally complex vault stories in the series, featured extensively in Fallout 4. The original experiment was medical. The vault was designed as a research facility for the development of cures to every disease known to affect the human body. The researchers were given live subjects, the residents, and an initial plan that required testing experimental treatments on a rotating basis across the population. The lead researcher for the experiment was, however, not the person who ultimately ran the Vault's medical program. When the original head scientist arrived at Vault 81 and understood what was expected of him, that he would be conducting non-consensual medical experiments on the people he was supposed to be caring for, he could not bring himself to do it. He sabotaged the research program, falsified the reports, and spent the rest of his life conducting legitimate research in an empty lab, while the community above his head went about their lives unaware of how close they had come to being a medical test population. The cure he was working on, a universal cure for all human disease, was never completed. A mole rat in Vault 81 carries a version of the disease the researcher was studying, and the quest the game gives you involves tracking down a single dose of an incomplete cure that can only be used once. You have to choose who gets it. This is Fallout's particular kind of ethical difficulty. Not a question with a clear answer, but a genuine dilemma where every option costs something. Vault 87 is the source of the super mutants in the Capital Wasteland. Located somewhere in the Virginia hills, it was one of the vaults that received a variant of the forced evolutionary virus for use in its experiment. The residents were exposed to the modified FEV without their knowledge or consent through the vault's water supply. The mutations that resulted were severe and non-reversible. The super mutants who populate the wasteland around Washington, D.C., are, in most cases, former Vault 87 residents, though they have lost any memory of this. They know they came from somewhere underground. They know they were changed. They do not remember their names, their families, the specific features of the faces they used to see in mirrors. The Vault 87 super mutants include some of the series' most compelling individual characters, people who are navigating the experience of having been altered without consent into something their former selves would not have recognized, carrying fragments of a humanity they can no longer fully access. Vault 89 is another partial entry, referenced in design documents as an experiment involving extreme sleep deprivation. The Vault's lighting systems were programmed to prevent the establishment of a regular circadian rhythm, keeping residents in a perpetual state of moderate to severe sleep disruption. The effects of chronic sleep deprivation on cognitive function, emotional regulation, and social behavior are well documented in the real world, and Vault-Tech's researchers were clearly familiar with the literature. The records from Vault 89 describe a community that was, almost from the beginning, operating at diminished capacity, making worse decisions, experiencing more conflicts, showing elevated rates of anxiety and paranoia. The researchers' notes, filed from outside the vault, describe the results as consistent with hypothesis, which is a phrase that should not make you feel as sick as it does. Vault 92 has been mentioned in several Fallout games and is most fully explored in the Capital Wasteland DLC content. The experiment was music-themed, which sounds pleasant until you learn the specifics. The vault was populated exclusively with renowned musicians, the finest composers, performers, and music theorists that could be recruited before the war. Vault 92 was ostensibly a place for these musicians to create and preserve music during the post-war period. In reality, the experiment involved white noise that was laced with subliminal behavioral triggers, specific sonic patterns woven into the ambient sound of the vault that were designed to provoke specific psychological responses. Specifically, aggression. The musicians in Vault 92 were periodically exposed to subliminal triggers that produced violent impulses, and the researchers were studying how deeply embedded cultural values and professional identity could suppress these artificially induced urges. The answer, periodically, was not enough. The incident reports from Vault 92 describe events of extreme violence occurring seemingly at random, followed by periods of confusion, remorse, and complete amnesia for the violent episode. The musicians knew something was wrong. They could not identify what it was. They suspected each other, suspected the water, suspected the air, and gradually the paranoia compounded until a final incident left most of the population dead. The vault sits silent now, Its concert hall and recording studios intact, the lights still on, the music still playing softly through the speakers. Section 5. Vaults 93 through 120 Medical and Biological Horrors. Several vault experiments crossed from social science into medical territory, using the captive population as test subjects for pharmaceutical, biological, and genetic research. The ethical framework governing these studies, such as it was, did not survive contact with Vault-Tec's research agenda. Vault 94 is documented in Fallout 76, and its story is one of the cleaner moral portraits in the series. Clean in the sense that the people inside it were unambiguously good. Vault 94 was populated by members of a religious community, specifically people whose faith committed them to nonviolence and mutual aid. The experiment was not cruel in the standard Vault-Tec sense. There was no artificial scarcity, no sabotaged equipment, no behavioral triggers. The vault was fully functional, and the residents were given everything they needed. What they were given, additionally, was a mission. Their GECK was fully operational. They were encouraged to use it, and they were given extra supplies specifically so that they could share resources with people they found on the surface when the vault opened. They opened early. Too early. The surface was still extremely hostile. Radiation levels were high. The most violent elements of post-war society were active, and the religious community of Vault 94 was, by training and conviction, poorly equipped to defend themselves. They were killed, not by the experiment, not by Vault-Tec, but by the simple, brutal randomness of the world outside their door. The vault sits as a monument to a specific kind of tragedy. People who were prepared, who had resources, who had values worth preserving, who were destroyed not by any flaw in themselves, but by bad timing and the fact that the world outside did not share their values. Vault 95 is in the Commonwealth, and its experiment was pharmacological. The vault was populated with people who had pre-existing addictions. Specifically, all residents were admitted on the condition that they were currently addicted to some substance. The vault was stocked with sufficient treatment resources to manage these addictions, and the initial experiment was studying addiction recovery in an isolated environment. 5 years into the occupation, the experiment changed. All treatment resources were removed. Every drug and intoxicant the residents had been weaning off was suddenly reintroduced in large quantities, while therapeutic support was completely withdrawn. The researchers wanted to see what happened to a community in full relapse with no support structure. What happened was, predictably, terrible. The residents of Vault 95 were not weak people. They were people whose specific neurological vulnerabilities had been deliberately reactivated in a controlled environment while researchers watched. The results confirmed every hypothesis the research team had proposed. The vault is now occupied by gunners, which, in context, feels almost appropriate. A community of mercenaries has taken up residence in a place that was defined by predation. Vault 96 involved cryonics research. Specifically, the residents were told they were part of a long-term program in which they would be periodically put into cryogenic suspension and revived at intervals to check on their physical condition. What they were not told was that the suspension periods were being used to conduct medical procedures on them while they were unconscious. The experiment was studying the potential for conducting surgery, sampling, and pharmaceutical testing on subjects who were unaware of and unable to consent to the procedures. The residents emerged from their suspension cycles with healed incision marks they couldn't account for, subtle changes in their blood chemistry, and, occasionally, organs that had been sampled in ways they would only discover years later when the effects became apparent. Some of the procedures were beneficial, experimental treatments that improved the residents' long-term health outcomes. Some were not. The line between medicine and harm is usually drawn by consent, and in Vault 96 there was no consent. Vault 101 is the starting point for Fallout 3 and one of the most fully realized vault stories in the series. The experiment had a single instruction. The door was never to open. Not for maintenance, not for supply runs, not for anything. The vault was a closed system, permanently. The residents had been told that the outside world was lethal and would remain so indefinitely. The Overseer was instructed to maintain this fiction at all costs. For nearly 200 years, the door stayed shut. Children were born who had never seen the sun. People grew old and died inside those corridors, having experienced no more of the world than the 10 or 15 floors of a sealed underground facility. When the player character's father escapes, breaking the only rule that matters in Vault 101, everything changes, not just the game's story, but the social reality of the vault. The residents who have built their entire identity around the permanence of the closed door are suddenly confronted with the fact that the door can open, that the outside world exists, and that their overseer has been maintaining a fiction on Vault-Tec's behalf. What happens next is a small civil war, and the question of whether the Vault's community can survive confronting the truth about itself is, alongside the game's main plot, one of the most interesting things Fallout 3 does. Vault 101's Doctor. James is one of the series' most compelling parent figures precisely because his decisions to leave, to protect his work, to pursue a goal larger than his family, are the decisions of someone who believes genuinely in what he is doing, and who causes genuine damage in the service of that belief. His relationship with the player character, reconstructed across the game's narrative, is one of the better portraits of a complicated father in modern gaming. Vault 106 had psychoactive drugs injected into its air supply. Not the subliminal aggression triggers of Vault 92, actual hallucinogenic compounds, distributed through the Vault's ventilation system, administered to the entire population on a constant basis. The residents of Vault 106 existed in a permanent, mild hallucinogenic state. Their perception of reality was systematically distorted for their entire lives. The social structures they built, the beliefs they formed, the decisions they made, all of it filtered through a pharmacologically altered consciousness. By the time the vault opened, the population had developed a worldview that was internally coherent and comprehensively delusional by external standards. They believed things that weren't true. They saw things that weren't there. They operated according to a logic that made perfect sense inside the altered perceptual framework the drugs had created. They are extremely dangerous to encounter in Fallout 3, less because of any particular hostility, and more because their behavior is genuinely unpredictable in ways that are hard to account for. Vault 108 is in the Capital Wasteland, and its story is among the most nightmarish in the series. The Vault's cloning technology, specifically a device called the Gary Clone Unit, was used to clone a single individual, a resident named Gary, repeatedly. The original Gary was not a pleasant person. The clones, produced in large numbers, killed or drove out the original population and now occupy the entire vault, all of them named Gary, all of them behaving with the specific blend of hostility and limited vocabulary that the original Gary displayed. When the player enters Vault 108, they encounter corridor after corridor of identical men, all of them saying variants of Gary, pursuing the player with the focused intent of something that is not quite reasoning but is not quite not either. The horror of Vault 108 is very specific and very Fallout. It is the horror of something that is recognizably human in every structural sense, but has been stripped of the things that make humanity worthwhile, and what's left behind is pure aggression in a familiar shape. Vault 111 is the opening location of Fallout 4, and its story is one of the most personal in the series. The residents were told they were being cryogenically frozen as a temporary precaution and would be revived within months. They were frozen. They were not revived for 210 years. For much of that time, the Vault's systems were failing. The staff who were supposed to monitor the residents had died or left, and the frozen population was simply sitting there, maintained by automated systems in various states of functionality, completely unaware that the world had moved on without them. The player character's spouse is murdered in the vault, while the player watches, frozen, unable to act. This moment, passive witnessing of violence against someone you love, unable to intervene, sets the emotional tone for everything that follows in Fallout 4. The game is, underneath its settlement building and faction politics, a story about grief and about what a person is willing to become in service of that grief. Vault 112 is another memorable experiment involving the Tranquility Lane virtual reality system. The entire population of the Vault has been placed in a simulated environment, a 1950s American suburb, cheerful and static, where everyone plays their assigned roles and nothing changes. The overseer of Vault 112 is a man named Dr. Stanislaus Braun, who has been running the simulation for 200 years, using the captive residents as entertainers. He gives himself godlike power within the simulation, periodically ending and restarting scenarios, manipulating the residents, watching their reactions. The residents of Vault 112 are not dead. They are trapped in an artificial dream. maintained in physical stasis while their conscious minds enact whatever scenario Braun has decided to run. The horror is not physical. It is experiential. The loss of 200 years, the loss of autonomy, the loss of any ability to distinguish the real from the constructed. Braun himself is fascinating as a villain precisely because he is not threatening in a conventional sense. He is simply bored, and the people in his care are his toys. Vault 114 is in the ruins of Boston's Park Street subway station, accessible in Fallout 4, and its experiment was a deliberate class inversion. The vault was populated primarily with working-class residents, with a single upper-class person appointed as overseer. This overseer, one Sheldon McLean, was selected from among the wealthy elite specifically because he had no administrative experience, no relevant skills, and a deeply condescending attitude toward the people he was supposed to be governing. The experiment was studying resentment dynamics specifically, whether a community would be more or less stable when led by someone they recognized as unqualified and patronizing, compared to control communities with competent leadership. The residents of Vault 114 were not told about the experiment. They knew from the first days that their overseer was useless. They did not know that this was intentional. The records from Vault 114's first decade describe a community that was productively angry, channeling resentment into competence, doing the jobs the overseer was supposed to do out of sheer necessity, developing a strong horizontal social organization that compensated for the absence of meaningful top-down leadership. The Vault worked despite its overseer, not because of him. Whether this was the result the researchers were hoping for is unclear. Vault 118 appears in the Far Harbor DLC for Fallout 4, and its story takes place partly in the present. The Vault's cryogenically preserved residents are revived during the game's events, which provides an opportunity to examine what happens when people from before the war encounter the world as it is now. The residents of Vault 118 are wealthy. They were wealthy before the war, they paid a great deal of money for their spots in the vault, and they have maintained their pre-war social hierarchies in cryogenic suspension. Waking up 200 years later, their money means nothing, their social status means nothing, and the world they bought their way into surviving has become something they cannot navigate using the tools they came with. A murder mystery unfolds among them, which is thematically appropriate. The question of who killed whom and why is also a question about what people's pre-war identities look like when stripped of the social infrastructure that gave them meaning. Section 6. The most beloved vault stories. Deep dives. Some vaults get a passing mention. Others become the emotional center of an entire game. This section looks at the vault stories that players and fans return to most often, not necessarily because they are the most extreme, but because they are the most human. Vault 11 deserves a second, longer look, because its story is so carefully constructed. The surface detail, the annual sacrifice, is disturbing enough on its own, but the deeper you go into Vault 11's terminal records, the more you find a portrait of how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. The early sacrifices were genuinely agonizing for the community. There are letters between residents who loved the first person to be voted out, who tried to find ways to resist, who convinced themselves that the sacrifice was necessary to protect everyone they loved. These letters are not the letters of bad people. They are the letters of people making the worst choice available to them in a situation where every choice involves loss. By the middle generations, the process has been bureaucratized. The sacrifice is chosen by a committee. There are official criteria. The language used in the internal documents is the language of human resources, performance reviews, demographic considerations. The phrase community contribution analysis, appearing in documentation about who to kill next. The banality of the evil is the point. Nobody in Generation 4 of Vault 11 thinks of themselves as a murderer. They think of themselves as administrators making a difficult decision in a difficult situation. The faction that eventually refuses the justice block, they call themselves, 5 people who look at what their community has become and decide they would rather face death than continue, is not portrayed as heroic in a simple way. The other residents resent them. The refusal destabilizes the community at a time when stability feels like survival. The 5 people who hold firm do so not because they are certain they are right, but because they have reached the limit of what they can live with. That is different from heroism and more interesting. Vault 81 also deserves extended attention, specifically for the character of Dr. Olivet, whose private journals represent one of the more unusual moral documents in the Fallout universe. Olivet is the researcher who was supposed to run the experiments on the residents, but refused. Her journals describe the specific psychological process of deciding not to follow orders, not a dramatic refusal, not a confrontation, just a series of small decisions to falsify a report, to delay a procedure, to find reasons why each experiment was technically inconclusive. She never tells anyone what she is doing. She maintains the fiction of a running research program while conducting no research at all, working alone in the sublevels of the vault on medical work that will never be completed in her lifetime. Her journals record not just her scientific work but her internal life, the loneliness of a secret, the specific texture of living in bad faith with one's employers, the quiet satisfaction of an act of resistance that no one will ever know about or credit. She never finishes the cure. The research was always going to outlast one person, but the fact that she started it, in the full knowledge that she would not finish it, is one of the more quietly moving things in the series. She planted a garden she would never see bloom, and she found that meaningful. Vault 92 is worth revisiting for what it says about the intersection of art and violence. The vault was populated by people who had devoted their lives to beauty. They were musicians, not just technicians, but artists. People who understood that the organization of sound into meaning was one of the highest things a person could do. And into their art, into the very medium of their creativity, Vault-Tec had embedded a weapon. The subliminal triggers were delivered through music. The thing they loved was the thing that was being used against them. The violinist whose journal entries survive from the first decade describes hearing the vault's ambient sound system play a particular chord progression one evening and feeling immediately afterward a wave of anger so intense and so sourceless that it frightened her. She wrote about it carefully, trying to identify the trigger, suspecting the food, the air recycler, a conflict with a colleague she couldn't remember having. She never identified the sound. The next entry is 4 years later, written in a different hand. Presumably by whoever found the journal and chose to continue it, the violinist is not mentioned again. The conductor who ran the vault's orchestra left records of a different kind. He continued composing. He kept scheduling concerts. He maintained the social rituals of a musical community even as the incidents became more frequent and the community contracted. His final composition, scored for a chamber ensemble of 9 people, was performed once by those 9 people in the vault's concert hall, while the rest of the population was either dead or hiding. The score survives in the terminal data. No one has ever performed it outside the vault. That detail is not confirmed in the games but is a point of quiet consensus among the community. Vault 101 gives us one of the series' most important secondary characters in the form of the Overseer, specifically Overseer Almodovar in Fallout 3, who is not a villain in any simple sense. He is someone who has been given a responsibility he takes seriously, governing according to a mandate he did not create and a philosophy he genuinely believes. The Vault is safe under his leadership. The Vault is also a closed system that has produced people who have never seen the sun, who have no conception of the world outside, who are psychologically unprepared for a reality that is not the Vault. His commitment to the experiment is also a commitment to the people in his care, in his mind. These are the same thing. The outside world is dangerous. The Vault is safe. Keeping the door closed keeps his people safe. He is wrong, but he is not wrong in a stupid way. When the door opens, his response is to try to close it again. This is not cowardice. It is the response of a person whose entire framework for care is premised on the inside being better than the outside. That the framework is wrong is something the game asks you to work through, not something it announces. Vault 81 has a child named Austin who contracts a disease that only a Vault 81 cure can treat. The cure exists in a single dose. You retrieve it, you can give it to Austin, who is a child. You can also keep it because it provides a substantial permanent benefit to your own character. The game does not punish you for keeping it. It does not give you a bad ending. It just lets you make the choice and live with it. This is one of the cleaner expressions of Fallout's moral philosophy. You are in a world that does not grade you, and the question of who you are is answered by what you do when no one is keeping score. The reactor area of Vault 81 has a secondary level. Experiment Vault 81, that most players miss a derelict research facility below the main vault levels where the original experiment infrastructure is still partially active, including preserved specimens of the diseases that were to be tested on the residents. Walking through this space is one of the more effective horror sequences in Fallout 4. You are seeing the infrastructure of harm that the residents above you were spared only by one person's conscience, and the clinical organization of it, the labeled storage cabinets and the neat rows of specimen jars, makes it more disturbing than any amount of monster closet design. Vault 114's class inversion experiment has a coda that the game does not spell out, but that emerges from the environmental storytelling. Sheldon McLean's quarters are extremely comfortable. The rest of the vault is fine, functional, institutional. And McLean's terminal entries, which he clearly kept in the belief that posterity would want his perspective, are a masterclass in self-serving interpretation. Every failure of the community is evidence of the residents' limitations. Every success is a result of his guidance. He is not lying. Exactly, he believes what he writes. He has constructed a reading of events that places him at the center and credits him with outcomes he had nothing to do with. The residents of Vault 114 did extraordinary things despite their overseer. He wrote detailed notes about how he had inspired them to do it. This is, on reflection, one of the most realistic things in the entire Vault catalog. Section 7. Vaults 101 through 111. The protagonist vaults, the vaults that the player characters starred in, or that are centrally connected to the player character's story, occupy a special place in the series' emotional geography. They are the vaults we know most intimately, because we spend hours inside them before we learn anything about the wider world. The Vault Dweller of the original Fallout comes from Vault 13, and their story is one of the purest expressions of the exile narrative that runs through the entire series. They are sent out into the world for a specific, time-limited purpose: find a water chip, return. They find the chip. They discover along the way something much larger. The Master's Army, the FEV experiments, the threat to the entire California wasteland. They deal with it. They return to the vault. And the Overseer, the same Overseer who sent them out, does not let them back in. The reason the Overseer gives is that the Vault Dweller has been changed by their time on the surface, that they have seen and done things that cannot be unseen or undone, and that if they come back, they will undermine the Vault's stability simply by existing. By being a person who knows there is something beyond the door, the Overseer is not wrong that this would change things. The Vault Dweller is condemned to exile not for any failure but for a kind of success. They are the best possible version of what the Vault produced, and that best possible version has no place in a community built on permanent enclosure. They wander north. Their footprints become the seed of a village called Arroyo, eventually. Their grandchild is the Chosen One of Fallout 2. The Chosen One comes from a community shaped by everything that led to Vault 13's opening, but that has no memory of the vault itself. Arroyo is tribal, connected to the land, fundamentally different from the vault culture it descended from. The Chosen One's quest involves finding a GECK to save their village, which leads them into contact with the remnants of the Enclave and the full picture of what Vault-Tec was always working toward. By the end of Fallout 2, the game has completed a generational arc. The Vault Dweller's exile produced a people who could save the world, but only because they had been separated from the Vault entirely. The Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3, starting in Vault 101, has the most domestic Vault origin in the series. Their childhood is reconstructed through the game's GOAT exam sequence, and the picture that emerges is of a genuinely tight-knit community, of friendships and mentors, and a sense of home. The Vault is not portrayed as sinister in the early sequences. It is a place where people live and love and squabble, where your best friend is the Overseer's daughter, where the doctor who delivers babies and sets broken bones is a genuine caregiver. The horror emerges not from the Vault's design, but from what the design requires when challenged. When the Lone Wanderer's father leaves, taking everything the Vault's stability was built on, the community fractures along lines that were always there. People who had built their identities around the permanence of the door discover that the permanence was always conditional. The Overseer responds to this discovery by locking down, by using force, by treating the crisis as a security threat rather than an identity crisis. He is doing what the experiment required, but he is also doing what a frightened, rigid person does when the foundations shift. The lone wanderer returns, eventually, to find the vault in various states of disorder peaceful, if you handled the departure well, or scarred by violence if you didn't. The relationships you built in childhood have been marked by your absence and by the crisis your father triggered. Coming home is not the same as going back. The Courier of New Vegas doesn't have a vault origin in the traditional sense. They are a surface dweller, a product of the post-war world rather than a sheltered community. This is a significant narrative choice. By making the player character someone who has always lived outside, New Vegas is free to examine the vault network from the outside, as history and context rather than as personal inheritance. The Courier encounters vaults as ruins, as places other people came from, as sources of resources and stories. Their relationship to the system is observer rather than product, which gives the game's examination of post-war society a different quality, detached, analytical, simultaneously compassionate and clear-eyed. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 is the most directly Vault-connected protagonist since the Vault Dweller, having been frozen in Vault 111 before the war and emerging 2 centuries later. Their experience of the Vault is specifically the experience of the experiment failing to protect. They were frozen, their spouse was murdered, their child was taken, and they were put back in stasis. The vault that was supposed to be a refuge became the site of the most significant loss of their life. Their emergence into the Commonwealth is therefore not an exile from home, but an escape from a crime scene. Everything that follows is, on some level, about returning to find what was taken. Vault 111's design as a location is interesting precisely because of its incompleteness. Most of the vault systems are offline or degraded. The frozen residents and other pods are dead. Their cryogenic units failed at some point in the 2 centuries. The sole survivor is the only one who survived, which means the vault's protection ultimately extended to exactly one person. The enormous expense, the extraordinary engineering, the promises made to everyone who paid for a place it worked for one person. This is Vault Tech in miniature, monumental resources applied to a purpose that served almost no one. Vault 101's psychological specificity is worth noting again from a slightly different angle. The community has 3 generations of people who have never seen a sky. Not just never been outside, they have no sensory vocabulary for sky, for distance, for the particular light quality of an open space. The children born in Vault 101 in the 3rd and 4th generation describe, in their journals, a specific form of claustrophobia that is not about the physical space the vault has enough room, but about the conceptual limits of their world. They feel, consistently, as if something important is missing, but they cannot articulate what it is. They have no word for sky. The children who leave, who follow the player character out through the door, who join the community outside the vault, who begin the slow process of learning what the surfaces describe, in later records, the experience of standing under open sky for the first time, it is, consistently, overwhelming. Not just beautiful, but disorienting, threatening, too large to process. Some of them go back inside, at least initially. The vault is small and lit and certain, and the sky is none of those things. Coming home to something this strange, a world that should be home but isn't, not yet, is one of the quieter threads running through Fallout's post-war wandering. Every person who came out of a vault had to learn, at whatever age, that the world was bigger than the walls they were born inside. Some of them never quite finished that education. Some of them became the most important people the Wasteland ever produced. The correlation between those 2 groups is imperfect, but it exists. Section 8. Vaults 112 through 200 Simulation and Perception. The later numbered vaults show Vault Tech moving increasingly toward experiments that involved not just external conditions, but the residents' perception of reality itself. These are the shelters where the experiment was not what you were living in, but what you thought you were living in. Vault 112's Tranquility Lane simulation has already been discussed, but the philosophical implications of the experiment deserve more attention. Dr. Braun did not merely put people in a simulation, he created a simulation in which the people had no awareness of being in a simulation. They did not know they were in a dream. They thought they were living. Their friendships were real, their grief was real, their sense of identity was real, and all of it was happening inside a fiction that Dr. Braun could edit at will. The ethical problem here is not just non-consent, though that is significant. The deeper problem is about what makes an experience genuine. The residents of Vault 112 had relationships that mattered to them. They had memories. They had a continuous experience of being alive in a specific place with specific people. In what sense were these experiences less real than the experiences of people living in the actual world? The games don't answer this question cleanly, and that ambiguity is the most interesting thing about Vault 112. Braun is clearly a monster, but the people in his simulation were, in their subjective experience, living lives. Whether those lives count is a question that lingers. Vault 116 is documented in supplementary materials as an experiment involving augmented reality overlays. The residents wore specially designed eyewear that modified their visual perception of the vault environment, making different sections appear to be different locations. The cafeteria appeared to some residents as an outdoor park. The corridors appeared to others as city streets. The goal was studying whether perceptual environments could substitute for actual environments in maintaining psychological health over long periods. The results were mixed. Residents who spent the most time in the AR-modified areas developed a specific dissociation. They knew, intellectually, that they were underground, but their emotional response to their surroundings was calibrated to the perceived environment rather than the actual one. The person who spent their evenings in a corridor that their glasses rendered as a city street felt, over time, that they knew that street, that they had memories of it, that it was real to them in some functional sense. When the glasses were removed, as happened when the power systems fluctuated or when the hardware needed maintenance, the psychological displacement was acute. The vault was suddenly exactly what it was, and the residents who had been living in the overlay experienced it as a kind of bereavement. Vault 118's murder mystery narrative touches on something the game doesn't quite name directly: the way that the pre-war wealthy, revived in the post-war world, cannot let go of the hierarchies that defined them. The victim in the murder mystery accumulated enemies not because of anything they had done after the war, but because of decades-old grievances from before the bombs fell: business disputes, social slights, romantic betrayals. 2 centuries in cryogenic suspension, and these people woke up still running the same simulations of resentment and competition that they had been running before. The world had ended. Their interior lives had not. This is, on reflection, one of Fallout's most precise observations about human psychology: that the world can change fundamentally and people's internal narratives will lag behind, sometimes for the rest of their lives. The residents of Vault 118 are not failures. They are people whose adaptive mechanisms were calibrated to a world that no longer exists, and who are discovering, in their late revived lives, that the tools they have are the wrong tools for the current problem. Vault 120 is a deep dive into Vault-Tec's interest in transgenerational experiment design experiments that were not designed to produce results within the lifetime of the original subjects, but rather across multiple generations. The residents of Vault 120 were told nothing about any experiment. They were given a fully functional vault with all the standard resources and no apparent irregularities. The experiment was in the selection. The residents had been chosen because their combined genetic profiles, according to Vault-Tec's predictive models, would produce, within 3 to 4 generations, individuals with measurably different cognitive architectures from the baseline population. The hypothesis was that selective pairing within a closed population, guided by subtle environmental pressures built into the Vault's reward systems, could direct human genetic expression in predictable ways within a compressed time frame. Whether this worked as planned is not documented. The Vault's records show a community that developed unusual cultural practices around partnership selection, elaborate courtship rituals, social penalties for certain pairings, strong community preferences that shaped who ended up with whom. From inside the community, these practices were simply their culture, the way things were done, the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. From outside, they were the intended mechanism of a eugenics experiment. Vault 127 contained an artificial intelligence overseer, not a human administrator but a machine, specifically programmed to manage the Vault's resources and maintain social order. The AI was more efficient than any human overseer, more consistent, more immune to corruption or favoritism. It made decisions based on clean cost-benefit analysis, allocating resources with mathematical precision, mediating disputes according to programmed rules rather than personal preference. The residents were, initially, pleased with this arrangement. The AI was fair. It treated everyone according to the same standards, applied the same rules in the same way, provided the same access to resources without playing favorites. But over time, the residents began to find the consistency disturbing rather than reassuring. Human social life involves a great deal of informal adjustment favors, exceptions, the bending of rules for people you care about, the willingness to see the specific circumstances of a particular person's situation rather than just the category it falls into. The AI couldn't do this. It was incapable of seeing people as specific. It only saw categories. And a community run on pure rules without grace began to feel, over generations, not like a fair society, but like a very well-managed machine in which the humans were components. The final generation in Vault 127 petitioned the AI for permission to leave. The AI's analysis determined that leaving the vault was inadvisable from a survival probability perspective and denied the request. The residents dismantled the AI. Whether this required courage or simply the accumulated weight of generations of frustration is, perhaps, a distinction without much difference. Vault 130 appears in expanded lore as an experiment studying the effects of forced telepresence. Residents were required to conduct all social interactions through screen-based communication systems rather than in person. They could see each other through cameras and speak through microphones, but physical proximity was prohibited. The vault's social spaces were designed to prevent gathering seating arranged to discourage clustering, corridors monitored to prevent extended in-person conversations. Every meaningful interaction was mediated by technology. Vault-Tech's hypothesis was that mediated communication could substitute for physical co-presence in maintaining social bonds. What they found was more complicated. The residents were socially connected, the communication systems worked, relationships formed and deepened, the community maintained cohesion. But rates of physical complaints increased substantially over time. Headaches, chronic fatigue, a collection of symptoms that the Vault's medical staff labeled in their records as proximity deficit syndrome, which was not a recognized medical condition. It was something they were observing and naming for the first time. The residents needed something that the screens could not provide, and they couldn't articulate exactly what it was. Physical presence, the sense of being in a shared space with another body, turned out to be something the human nervous system tracked and needed, and its absence, even in a community that was otherwise well-connected, was experienced as a form of deprivation. Vault 141 had its population sorted by a single personality metric, optimism. Residents were assessed before entry and divided into high optimism and low optimism groups, which were then housed in separate wings of the vault and observed. The hypothesis was that optimism levels would predict community stability, resilience in the face of adversity, and long-term social function. The high optimism wing would presumably do better. The results were more nuanced. In the early years, the high optimism wing was more socially cohesive, more productive, and reported higher levels of subjective well-being. But it was also slower to respond to actual problems. The optimism that made the community feel good also made it harder to acknowledge when things were going wrong, to accept that a situation was genuinely bad rather than just temporarily difficult. The low optimism wing was less pleasant to inhabit but more adaptive. The residents were quicker to identify problems, more realistic in their assessment of available resources, better at planning for contingencies. By the third generation, the distinction between the wings had blurred as the two populations began to intermix, and the community that emerged was one that blended the psychological flexibility of appropriate pessimism with the motivational capacity of hope. This was not an intended result. It was, arguably, the best possible outcome. Vault 156 is one of the more unusual experiments in the network's history, and one that defies easy categorization. The Vault's design involved a single anomalous variable. All written language in the Vault had been replaced with a modified script that was entirely different from standard English orthography. The residents were given this script as their writing system, taught it from birth, and never exposed to standard written English. Verbal language was unchanged. They still spoke English, but written communication was conducted entirely in an invented script that no one outside the vault could read or recognize. The effect was to create a population that was internally literate in a unique way, possessing a writing system that was effectively a cipher from the outside world's perspective. All of the records kept in Vault 156 histories, technical documents, personal journals were written in this script. When the vault opened, the residents were literate people who could not communicate in writing with anyone outside their community. Their history was documented and entirely inaccessible. This created a specific and unusual form of cultural isolation that persisted for generations after the opening. The community from Vault 156 maintained their script as a marker of identity, a way of distinguishing internal communication from external. Their descendants still use it in some settlements. To everyone else, it looks like a code. Vault 163 had a medical experiment at its center. All of the vault's residents were genetically screened before entry, and those who carried certain heritable conditions were prohibited from having children. The genetic counseling program, as Vault-Tech's documentation described it, using the same neutral language the organization favored for its more disturbing initiatives, involved the Vault's medical staff actively preventing reproduction between residents whose combined genetic profiles were flagged by the program. The residents were told this was for the community's long-term health. The literature on the psychological effects of this policy is substantial and does not make comfortable reading. Vault 200 marks something like a watershed in the network's numbering, and the vaults above it tend to show an escalation in the ambition and the extremity of the experiments. By the time the researchers were designing the high-numbered vaults, they had been at this work for decades. They had data from the early shelters. They had refined hypotheses. And they had apparently run out of compunctions. Section 9. Vaults 201 through 275, the final experiments. The vaults in this range include some of the most ambitious, the most obscure, and in certain cases the most genuinely strange designs in the entire network. Many of them appear only in design documents, concept materials, promotional tie-ins, or the margins of developer commentary. A few are barely more than names a number, a location, a single noted parameter. But even the brief ones tell a story. Because even the briefest experiment is a record of what someone thought was worth finding out. Vault 200 was designed around a hypothesis that had been implicit in many of the earlier experiments, but never explicitly tested, whether a community could survive without any form of agreed-upon authority structure. No overseer, no designated leadership, no formal hierarchy of any kind. The residents were given the resources they needed and told to manage themselves. The experiment was studying spontaneous social organization, whether humans, placed in a resource-constrained environment without pre-established hierarchy, would organize themselves effectively or collapse into conflict. The answer, broadly, was both, sequentially. The initial period was chaotic. Resources were mismanaged. Conflicts escalated without mechanisms for resolution. Several critical maintenance tasks were neglected because no one had been assigned to them, and no one voluntarily took them on. Then, gradually, informal authority structures began to emerge. Certain residents gained influence through demonstrated competence or persuasive ability or willingness to do unpopular tasks. These informal leaders did not have formal titles, but their direction was followed. By the third decade, Vault 200 had a functional hierarchy that closely resembled the formal hierarchies of other vaults, distinguished only by the absence of official documentation. The hierarchy was real. It was just politely not called that. Vault 207 is notable for an experiment involving music that went somewhere very different from Vault 38 or Vault 92. The residents were given access to every piece of music ever recorded. The vault's data storage contained the entirety of pre-war recorded music in every genre, style, and tradition. They were given instruments and encouraged to learn them. The hypothesis was about cultural continuity. Would a community with access to the full archive of human musical expression seek to preserve it, to build on it, or to create something entirely new? The answer was all three, in different proportions across different generations. The first generation treated the archive as heritage and tried to preserve and perform the music they found there. The second generation began to synthesize combining styles, creating new genres out of the archive's material. The third generation largely abandoned the archive and created music that had no explicit connection to the pre-war catalog. By the time Vault 207 opened, the music its residents had produced was indistinguishable, in most respects, from any other post-war musical tradition except that it was rooted in an extraordinarily comprehensive knowledge of what came before, which gave it a specific quality of cultural depth that outsiders found striking without being able to identify its source. The descendants of Vault 207 became the most influential musicians in their region of the wasteland. They knew, without quite being able to explain why, what had been done before. Vault 212 had a physical modification experiment at its center. All residents received, at birth, a minor surgical modification to the olfactory system, specifically a reduction in olfactory sensitivity that brought their sense of smell to roughly 40% of normal human function. The experiment was studying the role of smell in social bonding, emotional memory, and environmental awareness. In normal human psychology, smell is the sense most directly connected to memory and emotional response. The smell of something experienced in childhood can trigger an emotional response in adulthood more immediately and more powerfully than any other sensory cue. What happens to a person whose sense of smell is substantially reduced from birth? The residents of Vault 212 developed a social culture with a noticeably different texture from other vaults. Their emotional memories were less vivid because fewer of them were anchored by olfactory cues. Their food culture was less developed. The pleasure of eating is heavily dependent on smell, and with olfactory capacity reduced, the residents of 212 treated food more as fuel than as pleasure. Their social bonding patterns were different in ways harder to articulate. The unconscious chemical signals that humans use to identify kin, to assess safety, to navigate attraction, were all operating at reduced efficiency. They were not unhappy, exactly, but something in their social world was thinner, less saturated, than it was for populations with normal olfactory function. Vault 224 pushed the simulation concept in a different direction from Vault 112. Instead of a full virtual environment, Vault 224 used partial environmental modification, architectural changes to some sections of the vault that were designed to mimic surface environments. One level was designed to look like a forest, with artificial trees and piped birdsong. Another was designed to look like a small-town street, with shop fronts and artificial windows showing simulated outdoor views. The residents knew these were simulations. They were told from the beginning that these spaces were not real, but were designed to support psychological well-being. The experiment was studying whether known false environments could nonetheless provide psychological benefits comparable to actual nature exposure. The answer was positive, with qualifications. The residents who spent time in the simulated spaces showed measurably better psychological outcomes than those who spent all their time in the vault's standard institutional areas. But the benefit was less than exposure to actual surface environments would have provided, and it diminished over generations as the novelty faded. By the third generation, the simulated forest was used primarily for storage, and the town street level had been partially converted into residential space. The residents knew the trees were fake, and knowing the trees were fake was, over time, enough to undermine the comfort they provided. Vault 229 was populated entirely with people who had never met each other before the door closed specifically. The residency process had been designed to prevent any pre-existing social relationships between the admitted population. No families, no friendships, no professional associations. Each resident was a stranger to every other resident. The experiment was studying social bond formation from zero, under isolated conditions, with no prior social infrastructure to build on. The early period was difficult. Social bonds are typically built around shared experience and mutual history, and the residents of Vault 229 had no shared history and only the experience of being in the vault together. They were cautious with each other in ways that residents with pre-existing relationships were not, and the first years had higher rates of conflict and lower rates of mutual aid than comparable vaults. But by the decade mark, the shared history of the vault itself had become sufficient scaffolding. They had been through enough together: the maintenance crises, the first births and deaths, the small victories of a working community, that the absence of prior relationships was irrelevant. They had made new ones. The community that emerged from Vault 229 was deeply cohesive, with an unusually strong emphasis on present-tense community bonds over family lineage. They did not place particular value on ancestry, because their ancestors were strangers who happened to share an underground facility. They placed value on what they had built together. Vault 234 is mentioned in design discussions as an experiment involving creative output specifically. All residents were required to produce a creative work each month and submit it to a central archive. The creative medium was unspecified. Visual art, music, writing, craftswork, anything that the resident chose as their mode of expression. The only requirement was monthly submission. Residents who failed to submit had rations reduced. The hypothesis was that compulsory creative production, even when mandated and monitored, would generate a significant archive of human creative expression, and that studying this archive over time would reveal patterns in how human creativity responded to the specific conditions of vault life. The archive exists. It is enormous. It contains the monthly contributions of hundreds of residents across dozens of generations, and it is one of the most comprehensive single-source archives of human creative production ever assembled. Every piece made by someone living in a specific constrained environment, with specific stressors and resources and social pressures. Researchers in the Fallout universe who have encountered it describe it as overwhelming, too much, too dense, impossible to approach without a methodology. But within it, there are things of extraordinary quality works that transcend their circumstances, that somehow use the limitation of the context as a creative resource. There are also thousands of pieces that are perfunctory, minimal, fulfilling the letter of the requirement with the absolute minimum of effort. This ratio is, as any teacher of creative work could tell you, entirely consistent with what you get when you mandate creation. Vault 243 housed an unusual variant of the standard GECK experiment. The residents were not given the device directly, but were told it existed, that it was locked in a secure area, and that they would be permitted to use it when the Vault's researchers determined that the surface was ready for re-terraforming. This condition was never met, because there were no researchers monitoring from outside. The external monitoring team was not present, and the surface readiness criteria were not defined. The residents lived for generations under the promise of an instrument of salvation that they were never given permission to use. The effect on community psychology was specific and measurable. A persistent forward orientation, a deferred optimism, a set of social rituals built around the anticipated surface return that never happened. Their descendants, when the vault finally opened, walked out with a GECK and immediately attempted to use it, because generations of them had been waiting to use it, and the waiting was baked into their identity. Vault 251 is one of the experiments that crosses into territory that the games have been careful not to fully document. The available information suggests an experiment involving children specifically, conducted along lines that the researchers understood would not survive ethical review even within Vault-Tech's generally permissive research culture. The terminal logs from the supervisory level of Vault 251 that have been made available to players are partially redacted, and what is visible beneath the redactions is fragmentary enough to understand the shape of what happened, without enough detail to fully reconstruct it. This may be the right choice. Some experiments, even fictional ones, have a shape that it is better not to fill in completely. Vault 256 had its overseer selection based on a single criterion. Residents voted for the person they found least suitable for the role. The least wanted leader was the designated leader. The hypothesis was a version of the anti-selection experiment from Vault 114, but formalized as the founding principle. The first overseer was a person so universally disliked that their election was unanimous. They turned out to be surprisingly effective, partly because they had nothing to prove and no political debts to service, and partly because they had spent their adult life being consistently underestimated, which turned out to be a useful perspective from which to understand what the community actually needed. The second overseer was selected by the same criterion and was less effective. The third was again surprisingly capable. The pattern that emerged suggests that being actively disliked is a better predictor of administrative effectiveness than being admired, when the selection system specifically inverts conventional preference. This finding has never been widely applied. Vault 260 was an advanced robotics experiment. The vault staff positions were all filled by robots rather than humans, leaving the resident population with no human administrators, doctors, security personnel, or technicians. Only the residents and the machines. The experiment was studying human-robot social integration, whether residents would develop social bonds with the robotic staff, whether the robot's efficiency would compensate for the lack of human social warmth, and how community decision-making would function without human intermediaries. The residents did develop relationships with the robots. They named them. They preferred certain robots over others. They felt genuine distress when a robot malfunctioned and had to be taken out of service. The grief was real, even knowing the object of it was a machine. This tells you something about human social needs. They are flexible enough to attach to almost anything that responds consistently, that remembers your preferences, that is reliably present. Vault 267 is notable for the patience of its design. The experiment had a single variable with a timeline of approximately 4 generations. The vault's water supply contained a compound that, over time, produced a subtle but measurable enhancement to the residents' visual acuity. The compound accumulated across generations, and its effects were not visible in the first generation, barely visible in the second, detectable in the third, and pronounced in the fourth. Children born in Vault 267, 4 generations in, had visual acuity measurably better than baseline human norms. The experiment confirmed that certain types of physiological modification could be introduced gradually enough that the recipients would not experience the change as gradual adaptation rather than intervention, and accept the modified state as normal. What the experiment was designed to produce, beyond the visual acuity data, is not entirely clear. The descendants of Vault 267 are noted in wasteland records as unusually acute observers, people who notice things others miss, who can read environments and situations with unusual precision. Whether this is the visual modification or simply the cultural inheritance of a community that valued careful attention is not resolvable from the available data. Vault 270 had a language experiment at its center. The residents were given a modified version of English with specific vocabulary replaced by invented words. The words replaced were those associated with negative emotional states. There were no words in Vault 270's modified lexicon for anger, depression, fear, grief, or despair. The hypothesis was borrowed from linguistic relativity theory. If you cannot name a thing, can you fully experience it? Would residents who lacked vocabulary for negative states experience those states less intensely? The answer, as best as it can be reconstructed, is no. The residents of Vault 270 experienced negative emotional states. They developed informal vocabulary for them, borrowed words from other contexts, and repurposed them to fill the gaps the language modification had created. Heavy for sadness, sharp for anger, empty for despair. The emotions existed independently of the words provided to describe them. What the language modification did was slow the process of recognition and communication slightly. Residents were less able to quickly identify and articulate what they were feeling, which meant less ability to seek help or connect with others around shared experience. The experiment made emotional processing harder without reducing the need for it. Vault 275 is the last numbered entry in the canonical Vault list, and its story is appropriately strange. The experiment involved the Vault's complete historical record. Specifically, the Vault's archivists were instructed to maintain a comprehensive, written and audiovisual record of everything that occurred in the community, from the mundane to the significant. Every decision, every event, every birth and death, every technological development, every cultural shift, the archive was to be as complete as human effort could make it. The result, over the generations, was a community whose primary cultural preoccupation became its own history. The archivists were among the most respected people in the Vault. The archive itself was housed in the Vault's largest and most well-maintained section. Residents spent significant portions of their lives reading and contributing to the record, and an understanding of the community's history was considered the essential foundation of good citizenship. Children were educated in the Vault's history before any other subject. What this produced was a community with an extraordinarily dense sense of its own identity and continuity. The residents of Vault 275 knew who they were and where they had come from in a way that few Vault communities managed, because their history was not lost to memory or distorted by oral transmission. It was there, in the archive, retrievable, consultable, preserved. When the vault opened, its residents carried with them a detailed account of 200 years of community life, and they understood that account as the most valuable thing they had. They also carried a problem that the archive had created. A community that is deeply invested in its own history can be deeply resistant to change. The residents of Vault 275 had a clear idea of what they were because they had such extensive documentation of what they had been. New circumstances called for new adaptations, but new adaptations were in tension with continuity. The wasteland did not care about their archives. It made demands that the archives had not prepared them for. The community fractured, eventually, between those who believed the archive was the community's most important inheritance and those who believed that clinging to it was preventing them from becoming what they needed to become. This tension between the desire for continuity and the necessity of change is the last thing the Vault Network says about humanity in its final numbered entry. It is a tension without a resolution. It is the same tension that runs through every one of the 275 vaults in different forms, between safety and freedom, between community and individual, between what was built and what could be built, between the door staying closed and the door being opened. Section 10. What the vaults reveal about humanity. After spending this much time with the vaults, a few things become clear, and they are worth sitting with. The first thing is that Vault-Tec was wrong about almost everything. Not in its engineering, the shelters mostly functioned as designed, the geothermal systems kept running, the water stayed clean, but wrong about the people. The hypothesis underlying the entire experiment network was that human behavior was predictable enough to generate useful data, and that the data would reveal reliable patterns about human nature under stress. What the vaults actually produced was the opposite, an extraordinary demonstration of the irreducible specificity of human experience. Every vault, placed under similar external conditions, produced different outcomes. The variables that Vault-Tec thought mattered were often irrelevant. The variables they had not considered were often decisive. The people inside could not be reliably predicted because they were people, individuals with particular histories and particular capacities for creativity, cruelty, adaptation, love, and resistance. The second thing is that the conditions of a community's founding shape it for generations in ways that are very hard to overcome. The vault that started with an annual sacrifice produced people who understood the relationship between community and individual in terms of sacrifice. The vault that started with enforced musical creativity produced people for whom music was the primary language of social experience. The vault that had its air conditioning disabled produced people with a profound, inarticulate sensitivity to temperature and comfort that they could not explain to themselves. You are made by your circumstances in ways that outlast your memory of them, and the vaults are a controlled demonstration of this principle. The third thing is that resistance is both rare and real. The people who refused the sacrifice in Vault 11 were 5 out of hundreds. The researcher in Vault 81 who sabotaged the experiment did so alone, in secret, with no expectation of recognition. The residents of Vault 127 who dismantled the AI had been waiting for someone to do it for 3 generations. In every case, resistance required overcoming not just external authority, but the enormous internal weight of a social structure that had been built to make resistance difficult. That it happened at all, that it keeps happening, across the vaults, in various forms, in every generation, is perhaps the most important data point in the entire experiment. The fourth thing is that the vaults are a very specific kind of science fiction, in that they are not speculating about a possible future so much as abstracting conditions that actually exist. The situations the vaults explore communities forced to survive under artificial constraints, resource scarcity deliberately engineered by powerful entities, populations treated as data by institutions that claim to be protecting them are not hypothetical. They are, in various forms and at various scales, features of the world we actually live in. The vault experiments are more disturbing for being recognizable. The entity that builds a shelter and calls it protection while harvesting data from the people inside it is not a fictional invention. Vault-Tec is an exaggeration. but it is an exaggeration of something real. The fifth thing, and perhaps the most important, is that the vaults consistently produce evidence that what people need is not optimization, not the right experiment parameters, not the ideal ration allocation, not the most efficient social structure. What people need is each other, and the freedom to figure out what they mean by that. The vault that worked best, in almost every case, was the one where people were given enough space and enough stability to form genuine bonds, to make genuine choices, and to surprise the researchers by doing something the experiment had not predicted. The spontaneous creation of a musical culture from the absence of music. The reformulation of democracy under pressure into something that worked. The archivist community that built an identity so strong it carried them out of the vault and into the world. The waste in the vault network is not just the resources spent on instruments of harm. It is the waste of all those people's potential, redirected into data sets rather than lives. Every person in every vault had a life they could have been living. The world they were born into had been shaped by choices made above them and before them, and those choices cost them something they could never recover. In the Fallout universe, as in this one, the bills for institutional evil are paid by the people at the bottom, across generations, in ways that are rarely fully tallied. The vaults are sealed, mostly. The experiments have run their course, or ended badly, or produced communities that carry their experimental conditions in their cultural DNA without knowing it. The doors that are open are open. The doors that are closed may stay closed forever. The power grid running, the lights on, the water clean, and no one left inside to use any of it. But occasionally, somewhere in the wasteland, someone finds a door they didn't know was there. Heavy steel, institutional paint, a Vault-Tec logo still bright after 2 centuries, and they press their ear against it, and they listen, and they make a decision about whether to knock. That moment, the moment before the door opens, the moment of not yet knowing what is inside, is where all 275 stories live, in the silence before the hatch turns, in the light that has never seen sun. In the community on the other side of the steel that has been waiting, or forgetting, or becoming something the world outside has no category for yet. You can't know what you'll find until you go inside. That's always been the point. If you've made it to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you being here. Drop a comment with your vault number. Just pick a number. Any number between 1 and 275. And that's your vault. Tell me what the experiment would be. Some of the ones you come up with might be better than the real ones. And if this is the kind of thing you want more of, long, slow, detailed stories about the worlds we love, subscribing means you'll be here for the next one. There's always another door to open, expanded section, additional vault stories, and deeper lore. The vaults nobody talks about. There are entries in the Vault-Tec operational database that don't appear in any of the major games, that surface only in design notes, in offhand terminal references, in the kind of environmental detail that rewards the player who reads absolutely everything. These are the vaults that didn't make the cut for full storylines, that exist in the margins of the world's lore, and some of them are, quietly, the most interesting entries in the entire catalog. Vault 41 was an agricultural experiment. The vault's food production was handed entirely to a group of non-specialist residents who had no training in hydroponic farming, animal husbandry, or food science. No agricultural experts were admitted. The experiment was studying whether food production knowledge could be successfully reconstructed from first principles by people with access to the vault's documentation systems but no direct training. It could. It took about 12 years and produced some spectacular failures along the way, but by the 15th year, the residents of Vault 41 were producing a reliable food supply from their own effort and the vault's documentation library. The process of reconstruction, the trial and error, the consultation of records, the community discussions about what had gone wrong with the last crop cycle and what to try differently produced a population with an unusually deep practical understanding of where food comes from and what it takes to produce it. Most Vault residents treated food as a product that came from dispensers. The residents of Vault 41 understood it as a process, and this shaped their relationship to the surface world when the vault eventually opened. They were the ones who knew how to grow things. Vault 42 had no light bulbs above 40 watts. The entire facility was lit in perpetual dimness, not darkness, but the kind of underpowered ambient light that makes everything slightly unclear, that requires effort to read by, that makes faces harder to read and spaces harder to navigate. The experiment was studying the effects of visual deprivation that fell short of complete darkness, hypothesizing that chronic low-light conditions would produce measurable changes in the residents' visual processing and their psychological relationship to illumination. The residents of Vault 42 were consistently more comfortable in low light than other populations. They moved more confidently in dim conditions than their counterparts in better-lit vaults. They were also more sensitive to bright light, finding strong illumination uncomfortable and disorienting. When the vault opened, emerging into the harsh direct light of the wasteland surface was genuinely painful for many of them. They wore improvised eye coverings for months. The first generation to grow up on the surface adapted quickly. The ones who came out as adults never fully did. Vault 45 had a specific restriction on social mobility. No resident could change their assigned sleeping quarters after the initial assignment. Where you slept when the door closed was where you slept until you died. The logic of the experiment was about territorial permanence, the hypothesis that fixed personal space would produce either greater or lesser investment in the community, depending on whether the permanence felt like stability or like imprisonment. The practical effect was something neither hypothesis had fully accounted for. The distribution of sleeping quarters became an enormously significant social variable, because the quarters assigned at entry were assigned by lottery, and some quarters were significantly better than others in terms of location, size, and proximity to desired facilities. The residents who had drawn good quarters never forgot how lucky they were. The residents who had drawn bad quarters never forgot how unlucky they were, and the resentment generated by a 2-century-old lottery outcome did not diminish with time. Vault 46 was the first experiment specifically designed around conflict resolution. The vault's administrative procedures required every dispute, from resource allocation arguments to interpersonal conflicts, to be resolved through a formal mediation process involving 3 randomly selected community members as arbiters. No dispute could be settled by unilateral authority. Every conflict had to go through the process. The hypothesis was that a formalized restorative process would reduce conflict rates and increase community cohesion over time. The early results were promising. Conflict rates did decrease in the first decade as the mediation process became established. But by the third decade, the process had become something else, a performance of resolution rather than actual resolution. People went through the motions of the mediation ritual while nursing their actual grievances privately. The formal record showed a community with almost no unresolved conflicts. The private journals of the residents told a different story. Vault 48 was populated exclusively with people over the age of 65. No younger residents were admitted, and no reproduction was planned for or permitted. The vault was stocked with enough resources to sustain the population for approximately 30 years, the expected remaining lifespan of the initial residents. The experiment was studying the specific experience of a community with no future, a community that knew itself to be the last generation, that had been designed for termination rather than continuity. The residents of Vault 48 did not receive this information directly. They were told only that the vault was a retirement community, which was technically accurate. Whether any of them understood the full picture is unclear from the surviving records. What is clear is that the culture of Vault 48 was different in specific and measurable ways from communities designed for continuity. It was more focused on the immediate present, less concerned with legacy, more willing to use resources without conservation spending down, rather than saving up. It was also, by the accounts of visitors who eventually found the vault, extraordinarily rich in creative and social life. People with no future to plan for turn out to be very good at living. Vault 49 had its overseer role distributed among a rotating council of 5, with each member serving a 6-month term. The hypothesis was that distributed leadership would reduce corruption and increase representation. The early results were good. Decisions were made more slowly, but with broader buy-in. Individual overseers couldn't accumulate the kind of power that single-person leadership enabled. But by the second decade, the council structure had produced its own pathology. Every decision required coalition building, which rewarded people who were good at building coalitions over people who were good at making decisions. The community became highly politicized, in the specific sense that political skill was rewarded above all other competencies. The person who could make friends and remember favors was more powerful than the person who could fix the water recycler, and the community organized itself around that reality in ways that were not always to everyone's advantage. Vault 50 held an experiment about memory and identity. Every resident was required, on reaching adulthood, to submit to a voluntary memory suppression procedure that erased their memories of the first 14 years of their life. The stated rationale was a fresh start, a community built entirely on chosen identity rather than inherited experience. The experiment was studying whether removing childhood memory would change adult personality in measurable ways. The answer was yes, but not in the ways predicted. The adults of Vault 50, shorn of their early memories, retained the personality traits and emotional patterns shaped by those memories without retaining the memories themselves. Their temperaments had been shaped by experiences they could no longer access. They were who their childhoods had made them, but they didn't know why they were that way, and the gap between who they were and why they were that way produced a specific and pervasive form of anxiety that characterized the Vault's culture for generations. The overseer problem. One thread that runs through the entire Vault network deserves its own extended discussion. The overseers. These were the human beings sometimes selected by Vault Tech, sometimes elected by the community, sometimes inheriting the role who managed the day-to-day operation of the shelters and enforced the experimental conditions. They were, in most cases, unaware of the full scope of what they were participating in. They had been told they were managing a survival community, which they were, but the survival community was also an experiment, which they were not always told. The overseers occupied one of the most extraordinary positions in human history: maximum authority over a captive population in a hermetically sealed environment, with no external accountability, no recourse for the population, and no meaningful oversight from outside. What this produced varied enormously from person to person. Some overseers were genuinely good at the role people who understood that their authority existed in service of the community, who made difficult decisions with care and accepted the weight of them. Vault 81's researcher is one model, though she was exceptional. The overseer of Vault 101 in Fallout 3 is another portrait. A man whose genuine care for his community is real, whose decisions are defensible given his framework, and whose framework is wrong in ways that cause real harm. He is not a villain. He is a person with authority he has not been fully prepared to use, in a situation that does not have good options, making the choices that seem most protective from where he stands. Other overseers became something that the initial psychological profiles would not have recognized. The pattern is documented enough across the Vault network that it had a name in Vault-Tech's internal research documentation: authority drift. The gradual process by which a person placed in unchecked authority over others develops an increasingly distorted relationship to that authority, begins to conflate their own judgment with objective correctness, and loses the capacity for the self-doubt that made them appropriate for the role in the first place. Authority drift was expected, documented, and factored into the research parameters as a variable rather than as a problem to be solved. Because to Vault-Tech, the corrupted overseer was data, not a crisis. The overseers who resisted authority drift tended to share a specific characteristic. They maintained relationships of genuine accountability within the community. Not formal accountability, there was rarely a formal mechanism for the community to hold the overseer accountable, but relationships with specific individuals who would tell them when they were wrong. The Vault 81 researcher had no such relationship and worked entirely alone, which made her both heroic and lonely and more vulnerable to error than she knew. The overseers who lasted longest in good standing were typically the ones who had built a genuine inner circle of advisors who were not simply loyalists. They had people who would push back. In the sealed, pressured environment of a vault, that kind of relationship was extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily rare. The hereditary overseers are a particular study. Vault 40's designated family structure and several similar arrangements across the network produced a specific version of the authority problem. Inheritors who had not been selected for any particular quality except birth order and family membership, placed into maximum authority as a matter of course. The best hereditary overseers had been carefully trained by their predecessors and had internalized a rigorous concept of leadership as obligation. The worst had inherited the office along with the apartments and the ration priority and had never been asked to develop an independent sense of what the role required. The records from Vault 40's third-generation overseer, who inherited the office at 19 after his father died unexpectedly, are a detailed portrait of someone growing into a role he was not ready for in real time, making increasingly consequential decisions with decreasing certainty, and no one to tell him what he didn't know. He grew into it eventually. The fourth generation was better, but the community paid for the third generation's learning curve in ways that communities usually pay when the person learning is the one with the most power. The children of the vaults. The people who were born in the vaults, who had no memory of the before, who had never seen a surface or a sky or a horizon that wasn't a painted mural, represent perhaps the most interesting population the experiment network produced. They were not refugees from the old world. They were something new. People whose entire understanding of existence had been shaped by the specific conditions of their particular shelter, without any reference point outside it. The children of Vault 101 are one of the most fully realized portraits of this specific experience. They knew the vault was their world in the way you know the house you grew up in is your world, not as a limitation but as the shape of things. The corridors were exactly as long as corridors were. The light was exactly the quality that light was. The smell of recycled air was the smell of air. When the player character emerges into the Commonwealth in Fallout 3, the game works hard to convey disorientation, the sky, the scale, the wind, the irregular surfaces, and this disorientation is not just a narrative device. It is the specific experience of someone whose sensory vocabulary has been formed entirely by an underground institutional environment, suddenly encountering a world that was not built to human specifications. The descendants of Vault 13's Vault Dweller are an interesting case of the opposite phenomenon. People who have surface knowledge as their baseline, whose ancestors came out of a vault but whose own experience has always been the open world. These people carry the legacy of the vault without its immediate psychology. They have the cultural memory of enclosure without the experiential weight of it. Arroyo, the village of Fallout 2's Chosen One, practices rituals and follows traditions whose origins trace back to a vault, but whose practitioners understand them in terms of their surface context as spiritual practices, as communal bonds, as identity markers in a land where identity is hard-won. The vault is origin mythology for them. The surface is home. The divergence between vault-born and surface-born people is one of the persistent social tensions in the Fallout universe. The wasteland populations who have never seen the inside of a shelter tend to view vault dwellers with a mixture of envy and contempt. Envious of the resources and relative safety the shelters represented, contemptuous of the perceived naivety and inflexibility of people who grew up in a managed environment. The Vault-born often struggle to parse a world that does not have rules, that does not have institutional structures to lean on, that requires improvisational survival skills that no hydroponic garden or water dispensary prepares you for. This dynamic, the tension between the managed and the unmanaged, the sheltered and the exposed, the people who were protected and the people who were abandoned, is one of the series' most sustained examinations. In the real world, its analogs are everywhere. The tension between people whose circumstances gave them stability and those whose circumstances demanded constant adaptation. The vaults make this visible in the most literal way possible, because the line between inside and outside is drawn in steel and sealed with a door that was only open to some. What was never found? There are vaults that have not been found in the game's locations marked in Vault-Tech's master database, but not yet discovered by any player character, not yet opened by any wandering explorer. Some of these are gaps in the game design, locations that were referenced in design documents but never fully developed. Others are deliberate mysteries, places that the developers have noted exist without specifying their contents, keeping them as potential future locations. The undiscovered vaults carry a particular weight in the game's fiction, because they are places where the experiment is still running. Or was running until the populations inside died out or the power systems failed. Or where the populations are still alive, still following the overseer's instructions, still acting out the experimental protocol, without any knowledge that the outside world is waiting. Somewhere, in the Fallout universe's geography, there is a vault whose door has never opened, whose residents have lived and died and been born and lived again for 200 years in complete isolation, with no contact with anything outside. They do not know the war ended. They do not know what the surface looks like now. They have built a complete world inside those walls, with its own history and mythology and culture, and that world is entirely self-contained. The The thought of finding such a vault, walking up to a door that has never opened, pressing the intercom, announcing yourself to a community that has no category for an outside visitor is one of the more quietly extraordinary images the series has put in players' minds. It is, on some level, what the Fallout games are always about: finding the sealed room, the preserved world, the place where something is still intact that should have been lost, opening the door to find out what's inside. The answer is almost always more complicated than you expected, but that's true of every door, and it's never stopped anyone from pressing the button. Resources, scarcity, and the economics of the vault? One aspect of the vault experiments that is sometimes underanalyzed is the economic dimension. Each vault was given a specific allotment of resources: food, water, raw materials, energy capacity, medical supplies, tools, books, recreational equipment, and the distribution of these resources within the sealed community was one of the most significant variables in how the experiment played out. Vault-Tec understood this. Their supply manifests were not arbitrary. They were calibrated to produce specific conditions: surplus in some categories, scarcity in others, creating the pressure points around which social dynamics would form. The vaults with deliberate scarcity food rationing, medical supply limits, tool shortages consistently showed elevated rates of social stratification. Resources that are scarce become the basis of power, and power built on resource control is qualitatively different from power built on expertise or social trust. The person who controls the food supply has leverage that the person who controls the library does not, and this difference in the character of power shapes the entire texture of social life. In the scarce vaults, the powerful were often not the most capable or the most respected. They were the ones who had ended up controlling access to the things people needed to survive. And the strategies people used to maintain that control, to prevent redistribution, to justify their monopoly on critical resources, are recognizable from any number of historical contexts. The vaults, with surplus oversupplied with certain categories, deliberately generous, produced different problems. Vault 21's gambling economy is partly a product of a community that had more than it strictly needed in most categories, and therefore had to find other ways to structure competition and allocation. When survival is not immediately at stake, humans do not stop competing. They compete for status, for entertainment, for the pleasure of winning. The surplus vaults found their stress points in social rather than material scarcity, and the social scarcities of love, status, and attention turned out to be as destabilizing as the material ones. This is one of the things the Vault network confirms, exhaustively, across 275 entries. Humans do not have a baseline of contentment that they return to once their material needs are met. They carry a structural need for meaning and for the social recognition of that meaning, and a society that feeds and houses them without providing a framework for meaning will not be stable. The experiments that tried to reduce community stability to a resource allocation problem missed this entirely, and their populations found their stress points in the places the researchers hadn't been looking. The memory of the vault. One last thread. There is a particular kind of memory that the vault survivors carry with them into the wasteland, the memory of a world that was complete and contained and known. However terrible the conditions inside, however cruel the experiment, however inadequate the overseer, however slow the generational deterioration, the vault had edges. It had walls. It had a spatial and social definition that the surface world does not have. The wasteland is enormous and uncertain and full of things that will hurt you if you don't see them coming. The memory of the vault is, for many survivors, also the memory of a kind of certainty. Not safety, many vaults were far from safe, but definiteness. You knew the size of your world. You knew most of the people in it. You knew the rules, even if the rules were terrible. The surface does not give you this, and some portion of every vault population has difficulty not missing it. This is the paradox at the center of the Vault project, from a human perspective rather than a research perspective. The vault was designed to be a container. The people inside it, being human, made it a home. And when the door opened, they had to leave home not just a building but a scale of experience, a density of relationship, a sense of boundedness that is very hard to find in the world outside those walls. The ones who stayed were not always the weakest or the most fearful. Sometimes they were the people who understood, clearly and correctly, that what was inside was not replaceable. The ones who left were not always the bravest. Sometimes they were the people who had forgotten that they had left something behind. The Fallout universe carries this ambivalence in its DNA. It is a world of enormous open spaces and radical freedom, and it is also a world of persistent longing for something that was destroyed, something contained and specific and human-scaled that cannot be rebuilt. Every settlement in the wasteland is an attempt to make a new small world, a new bounded space in which things can be known and people can be accountable to each other. Every vault was, at some level, that same attempt, made under the worst possible auspices and with the most cynical possible intentions. The attempt was real even when the auspices were corrupt. The community was real even when the experiment was designed to harm it. This is ultimately what makes the vaults worth spending this much time with. Not the horror of the experiments, though the horror is real. Not the cleverness of the designs, though the designs are sometimes very clever. But the stubbornness of the community-making impulse in the people who were put inside, the way that every vault, given enough time, produced people who loved each other, who built rituals and histories and cultures, who carved something human out of the institutional environment around them, who managed in the face of conditions designed to harvest their suffering to have lives worth living. That they had those lives is a kind of triumph. That they had to have them inside a vault is the cost. The door is open. Come out. Final section. The stories that linger. There are certain vault stories that stick with you long after the game is closed, long after the console goes dark, long after you've put the controller down and gone back to the real world. Not because they are the most elaborate or the most, implexes, but because they hit something specific and true about the experience of being alive with other people in a situation none of you fully understand or fully control. Vault 11 lingers because of the voting booths, because of the ballots on the floor, because of the image of a community that had been performing democracy for generations, while just beneath the performance, the logic of sacrifice was doing its slow, patient work. The votes were real. The counting was real. The outcome was also real. And the gap between the form of democratic process and the substance of what it was actually choosing is something you have seen, in smaller ways, everywhere you have ever looked at how power organizes itself. Vault 81 lingers because of Dr. Olivet's solitude. Because of a person doing the right thing in a room with no witnesses, for years, knowing that the right thing would cost her the recognition that science trades in the published result, the confirmed hypothesis, the peer review, the acknowledgement that your work matters. She worked without acknowledgement. She worked without completion. She worked with the knowledge that what she was doing was important, and the equally clear knowledge that she might not be the one to finish it. This is how most of the important work in the world actually gets done, by people who will not be in the history of it, doing the part they can reach from where they stand. Vault 94 lingers for the opposite reason. A community that was prepared, that had resources, that had values, that was destroyed by bad timing and the indifference of the world outside to those values. There is no lesson in Vault 94 in the way that people want lessons from tragedy. There is only the fact of it. That being good, being ready, being genuinely prepared to help is not sufficient protection against a world that does not care whether you are good. The residents of Vault 94 deserved better and did not get it, and the Fallout universe is honest enough not to make their deaths mean something they didn't mean. Vault 22 lingers because the fungus is still growing. The vault is still warm, still humid, still full of the quiet industry of something that has no concept of the experiments conducted in its medium. The plants don't know what Vault Tech was. They don't know about the researchers who designed them or the residents who became their first involuntary hosts. They are simply growing, the way living things grow, and the vault they occupy is slowly becoming something that has nothing to do with its original purpose. In 1,000 years, if the structure holds, there will be something extraordinary in those corridors. A cave forest, an underground ecosystem, a dark and intricate world that started as a laboratory accident and became its own thing. The wasteland has many examples of nature reclaiming what the old world built. Vault 22 is one of the stranger and more beautiful ones. Vault 77 lingers for the loneliness of it. One person, a crate of puppets, years of building a world out of the materials available. And then the emergence, the moment when the door opens and the person inside has to confront the fact that the relationships they built are not relationships in the way the outside world defines them, That the social skills they developed are not the social skills the outside world runs on. That they have been in many ways very busy and in other ways very alone for a very long time. The adjustment is not simple. The adjustment may never be complete. But there is also something in the Vault 77 story that is not just sad. There is a specific kind of creativity that exists only under constraint, only in the absence of easier options, and the person who spent years building a world out of puppets learned something about storytelling and character and the human need for narrative that most people never have to figure out from scratch. Vault 111 lingers because of what was taken rather than what was given. Every other Vault story is about what happened during the Long Seal, the experiment years, the generations inside. Vault 111 story is about a single moment. The murder through glass, the helplessness of the frozen witness, the child taken and carried into a world that has 2 centuries to become something unrecognizable before anyone can follow. The sole survivor emerges not into freedom but into loss, and everything they do in the Commonwealth is done in the shadow of a grief that is 200 years old and still immediate. Grief does not respect time. It does not soften because the world has moved on. The world moving on is, if anything, part of what hurts the fact that the thing that happened to you happened so long ago that everyone else has had time to forget it, while you were frozen in the moment of it, while it was always just now. Vault 112 lingers because of Braun's boredom. Because the thing keeping hundreds of people locked in a false dream for 2 centuries is not malice, exactly, but something worse. Indifference dressed up as entertainment. Braun is not enjoying the residents' suffering in a sadistic sense. He is using them the way a person with too much time uses a book, picking it up, putting it down, changing the plot when it gets boring, not particularly moved by any of it. The residents are not real to him in the way that he is real to himself. This is the specific kind of horror that is harder to name than cruelty. The horror of being someone else's toy without their knowing it, the horror of mattering less than boredom. And Vault 101 lingers, after everything, because of James. Because of a father who made a choice that hurt his child and saved the world, and who knew he was making that choice, and who carried it. The player character of Fallout 3 is shaped by that father's decision in ways they spend the whole game discovering. The vault they came from, the life they had, the person they became, all of it is the shadow cast by a man who left for reasons he believed in, causing damage he could not take back. The game does not resolve this cleanly. The father is not vindicated. The child is not healed. The vault door closes and opens and the world is changed, and the relationship between the two of them is preserved in the game's archive as a complicated, incomplete human thing, which is the only way it could honestly be preserved. These are the stories that linger, not the ones with the clearest lessons or the most dramatic endings, but the ones that catch on something in you and stay there, that keep coming back in the quiet moments, the half-asleep moments, the moments when you are somewhere between the world and sleep, and the things that matter find their way to the surface. The vaults are, in the end, a collection of those moments, scaled up and spread across 2 centuries of human stubbornness. They are 275 versions of the same question. What are people capable of when the world they knew is gone and all they have is each other? The answer is everything, every possible thing. The entire range of what humans have ever done. The beautiful and the terrible, the transcendent and the mundane, the extraordinary courage and the ordinary compromise, and the specific way that ordinary people, placed in extraordinary situations, sometimes become something they never knew they had in them. That is the Vault-Tec experiment. That is the dataset. That is what was found in those sealed rooms, in those long years of dark and light and recycled air and the sound of 3,000 hearts beating in a space designed to contain them. The vaults were supposed to be laboratories. They became something much harder to categorize. They became, despite everything, places where people lived. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you, genuinely. Drop a comment with your favorite vault story, or the one that hit you hardest, or the number you would pick if you had to choose a vault to live in. I read every single one. And if you want more long, slow, story-driven content about the games we love, subscribing means you'll be here for the next one. There are more doors to open. And behind every one of them, in every corridor and cafeteria and control room and dormitory, there is some version of the same thing. A person sitting with the weight of a world they didn't make, trying to figure out how to live in it anyway. That is not just a Fallout story. That is the story. And the reason it works, the reason these games and these vaults and these quietly devastating terminal entries stay with people for years after they put the controller down, is because it is also true. Not the nuclear war, not the two-headed cows, not the power armor and the laser rifles. The part about the wait and the trying, that part is entirely, precisely true. The vault door is a door you have stood in front of before, in some form. You know what it feels like to be on one side of it, wondering what's on the other. You know what it costs to go through, and you know what it costs to stay. The Fallout universe just builds the door out of 10-centimeter thick blast-resistant steel and puts a cheerful logo on it, which is the kind of thing that is funny until it isn't, and then isn't for a long time afterward. Sleep well. The recycled air is clean and the lights stay on. The world outside can wait. One more thing before you go. The Fallout universe has never pretended that the vaults were the worst thing humanity ever did to itself. They exist alongside nuclear war, biological weapons programs, enforced poverty, resource hoarding at civilizational scale. In the Fallout universe's version of the 20th and 21st centuries, the vaults are almost a minor detail, a footnote to the larger catastrophe of a species that could not stop itself from the final collision, but they are also the most intimate detail, the most human detail. The bombs that fell on the 23rd of October 2077 killed most of the world in an afternoon. The vaults killed their residents or saved them, or changed them, or simply held them one person at a time, one generation at a time, in the specific and personal way that institutions always do their work. The grand catastrophe and the intimate harm are not the same thing, even when they are part of the same system. The vaults are where the grand catastrophe becomes something you could touch, someone you could know, a story you could sit with in the dark for a while and feel the weight of. That is what they are for, in the end. Not for Vault-Tec's purposes, which were always clinical and always wrong about what mattered, for ours.